Hello, everyone. As you know, we are notorious for going over time, so I'm going to try to keep us on time as much as I can. We built in some buffer time, but our goal is 10:30, so we'll see if we make it. Clinicians, researchers, industry partners, and cherished families, welcome to the CUTE Syndrome Foundation's 9th annual Clinician, Researcher, and Family Gathering. My name is Kacie Craig, and I'm honored to stand before you as the executive director of this remarkable organization and the proud mother of 2 incredible children, Lincoln and Stella. As many of you know, my journey has been shaped by the challenges and triumphs that come with a diagnosis of SCN8A. My daughter Stella was diagnosed at the tender age of 5 months old. Like many of you here tonight, this experience not only defined my family, but has also fueled my commitment to making a meaningful impact in the lives of those affected with SCN8A and their families. In the earlier part of this year, TCSF's Meaningful Change educational series embraced our mission and our resilience under the theme, From Surviving to Thriving. This theme has been consistently woven through the fabric of our activities throughout this year. It captures the difficult journey that we undertake together, but also reflects the hope to move beyond merely coping and instead looking towards a future where individuals with SCN8A and their families not only endure, but thrive. This theme found expression in TCSF's newest initiatives as well. Securing a Global Genes mental health grant enabled the training of 4 TCSF volunteers in the grief recovery method. This training created the opportunity for us to provide in-house, one-on-one, and group grief recovery courses. Additionally, TCSF proudly supported 3 CUTE Connection family meetups in Branson, Missouri, Atlanta, Georgia, and Tuscany, Italy, facilitating meaningful connections for over 125 family members. Furthermore, we extended sponsorship to 8 SCN8A parents to participate in a specialized 6-month group life coach course called Pathway to Peace. This group was tailored specifically for parents caring for special needs children and fostered personal growth and support. Last, but certainly not least, TCSF has collaborated with SCN8 parents, Krista and Shawn Smith, to establish the Connor James Smith Patient Assistant Grant Program, open to all SCN8A families to apply. I'd now like to invite grant founders, Krista and Shawn, on stage to share with us their son Connor and how his legacy continues to impact each grant recipient.
Hi to our SCN8A family, researchers and clinicians. I'm Krista Smith, my husband Shawn, and on the screen you see our beautiful son, Connor James Smith. He was our angel, our happy child, and our only child. He passed away on December 28, 2022 at the age of 12 from respiratory failure and seizures. And he was diagnosed in the very early days. He was one of the originals. 2013, we received the SCN8A de novo diagnosis, and he was number 13, which is quite funny because there's a couple of us that are number 13. And with that time, we knew he is super rare and super amazing. And he was severely affected, non-ambulatory, non-verbal, but he was a joy. He was sweet. He was our biggest blessing, and he brought us immense joy. So as he was ending his life last November after being very ill, we made a promise to Connor. We promised we would take his superhero spirit. Oh, thank you. Shawn's like, you need to go forward. We promised we would take his superhero spirit, we would take his joy, and we would take his rainy day fund, and we would take it to TCSF, to his SCN8A community and friends. So I called up Kacie, executive director of TCSF, and had mentioned what we wanted to do, that we wanted to honor Connor and work on a grant and partnership. And she was quite flabbergasted. She was already chasing this dream, dreaming this dream of a patient assistance grant. And we just found that our dream was aligning. So what we've really designed is we wanted to come up with a patient assistant grant that was easy. We already have too much paperwork that is difficult, hard to fill out, complicated, oftentimes expecting the worst. So in this case, we wanted to come up with something that was easy for families to apply to, and that in as many cases as possible, we could make that decision to provide those resources. We also wanted an expedited process for emergencies. We know that in cases of a medication not getting a prior auth, that's an emergency. We know in the case of a burial, that's an emergency. And we created a nice, easy process for that. We wanted it to be global. We wanted to reach out to our entire SCN8A family. And then we also wanted to cover things that insurance may not cover in full, but additionally, and more importantly, we wanted to cover things that insurance might not even touch. And with that, Shawn will talk to you about some of those things.
So all of our children being challenged, inside, outside, we all have the knowledgeable issues of what they go through on a daily basis, and what is approved, what's not approved. We always tried to make sure that Connor had an experience outside, which for our kids can be difficult. Part of his joy was from being outside and enjoying outside activities. So, with our families, friends, they deserve that opportunity to get out there. And sometimes the limitations are undeniable. So there's equipment and there's special tools that can create these opportunities and other types of resources to hit the goals of that celebration of life. And as part of this grant, we want to make sure that there's access to those things. Not just for the kids, but for the families as well. And on the next slide, we kind of highlight a lot of the things that Connor had that, for an example, I'm sure you're all familiar with or need to know about, but there's the kinder carry, gymnastic mats, bath chairs, the hydraulic lift as they grow older. We know that that's extremely important to get for aging parents and aging children. Of course, burial costs, any random supplies that aren't approved, and communication devices to assist for those, especially nonverbals. And then, in Connor's case, we were blessed with a trip to Disney, and that was an airplane flying harness that made it possible for him to make. So all of these things are vitally important to hit, whether they're covered or not covered, and the children deserve to have that. And we want to see them have that. We want to see a joyous life being lived because of this grant. Some more opportunities there, hydraulic standards, off-road vehicles that are not necessarily special needs strollers, but get them where they need to be. Connor's case, the Bob we used for many years, that was a starter kind of a wheelchair, but there's something else called a Wyke that really in his later years he used up to a 300-pound rating. Getting in the pool, vehicle modifications, anything for your house equipment that you need, therapy, tools, and wheelchair costumes, all glorious stuff, so,
So where are we? In our first year, we've had a tremendous amount of success. And that starts with the fact that we were able to vest this grant, bring those funds, partner with TCSF, but it also took you guys partnering and actually applying and saying, this is what I need so that my child can improve, have what they need, or thrive. So looking at this chart, I'm hoping you'll geek out with me for a second because I love looking at the analysis here. We were able to grant 13 opportunities this year. 62% were domestic and 38% of the number of those applications were international. 92% came from mom applying and 8% from dad. But what's most impressive is that over $44,000 went out to families, every single penny. We were able to give 58% of that budget domestically, and then 42% of that went internationally. But I think what's most impressive is when you look at that item on the right-hand side of the slide, type of assistance. We had almost 60% of the budget that went to out-of-pocket or not covered at all, durable medical equipment and other equipment needs, as well as therapies and medications. That is extremely important to our families, and we saw that being an immense need in the budget. Additionally, we had 17% that went to helping families give their beloved child a proper goodbye. That was a really important one, and an important one for Shawn and myself. 16%, my favorite kind of spending, I know it's Kacie's too, is joy. We were able to grant things like bubble makers that could give a child a sensory enjoyment. And these are things that are helping them thrive. We absolutely want to approve these kinds of requests, so put them out there. And then we also had 8% that went to medical devices and emergencies. And that's my other favorite kind of spending here, is that this grant can be here for your family in an emergency. We don't want any child to ever be in a situation where they don't have what they need. We also are doing a ton of fun fundraising. So we spent the year having an Honor Connor run. My running club, the Tri-City Roadrunners, put this on. We had people come out and run a 5K, 10K, or half marathon, and we raised over $5,000 that were able to go back to the grant. Additionally, we've had one of Connor's caregivers, his employer, for their 100th anniversary, was giving each employee $1,000 to donate to any organization of their choice, and they chose our organization. They chose Connor's grant. And we also were selected by TCSF for the Giving Tuesday campaign that just happened. Danielle Hayward did an amazing job pulling that together and shared the stories of the grant recipients. And if you haven't been out on the SCN8A page and looked at those stories, I encourage you to do so, because you really see the grant live out and the inspiring stories of these children receiving what they need or something that has made their life enjoyable. So we're going to keep fundraising, and we would really ask that you guys share ideas with us. If you have other thoughts on this, we're always willing to learn and do more. And so then I'll end here just saying thank you. I want to thank all the families that applied. Without you doing this grant that Kacie and I were dreaming about, we weren't sure what the need was, and it proved out there's an absolute need, and we need to keep working hard for you. We want to thank TCSF. Thank you for partnering with us. Thank you believing that this fit into the community. Thank you, Kacie. Thank you for everything you do behind the scenes. You make our dollars go so far, and we really appreciate that. And then we want to encourage you all to apply, to share the donation link that's sitting on your table. There's a little QR code so that people can donate to the grant, and we can continue to do really great work for the community and do things to honor Connor. But thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Krista and Shawn, not only for sharing Connor with us, but for your partnership. It has truly been an absolute honor to work with both of you and to carry out Connor's legacy in such a meaningful way. Throughout this evening, we will delve into the latest research, share invaluable clinical insights, and draw strength from the collective experiences from our community. This room is filled with over 150 people. It may even be close to 180 because we frantically got more chairs in here last minute. Everyone in this room shares dedication to progress, to fostering hope, and to pushing boundaries. We are not merely spectators of change. We are the architects. The clinicians, the researchers, the industry partners, the families, all working together to bring about meaningful transformation. Thank you all for being a part of this community, for your unwavering support and your commitment to making a difference. Let's embark on this journey together from surviving to thriving and create a future filled with hope, resilience, and meaningful change. Now, let's hear from our first presenter. I would now like to introduce Dr. Brian Pfister, VP of Medical Affairs at Praxis Precision Medicines, presenting Prax 562, Reflection and Direction on a Next-Generation Anti-Seizure Small Molecule in Development for SCN8A DEE.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. It's always interesting, as she mentioned, I'm VP of Medical at Praxis, but I'm also a father of a son with epilepsy. So it's always difficult, I think, to speak to audiences like this for me, because you're not that dissimilar than I am and some of the things we've gone through. So I'm excited to be here, excited to give you updates on what we're working on. Hopefully these can make differences in your lives as well. But again, thank you to all the families and to TCSF. We've worked with you guys for a number of years. We've been up here, different people from the company have been here to speak on our behalf. But again, this year I think is special for us in a lot of ways. Love that you guys are here, love the number of people turning out. So thank you for all of that. Forward-looking statements, so some of the information contained within the presentation tonight is forward-looking, so just FYI, disclaimer. So I gotta talk about my why. Like, why am I here? Being a father, it's important to me. I've been doing this for 25 years in research and development, been in industry for 25 years. I can't believe it's really that long because I'm only like 29, so I'm not sure the math works out like that, but why I'm here is to make a difference. And ultimately, Praxis, for me, the company, is in that same boat. Like, we have our mission statement and we have like our goals. Really what we want to do is, help patients. We want to help patients faster than anybody else has done before. And we want to create an opportunity for us to do it again and again and again. So as we kind of work through the iterations, as we work through the data that comes in that tells us information about what to do next, it's really important for us to not lose sight of the why. And I actually have some colleagues in the corner table who are joining me, who are actually part of the biology group, early discovery, as well as clinical at Praxis. So I'm so happy they joined us because they all have a role to play in these steps that we take. So it's really nice to see them here and to support me tonight as I talk to you. So when we look at how do we do this, right? So this is kind of the inside scoop of how do we develop drugs. Praxis is different than some companies in that we really focus on genetic underpinnings. So we start with the genetics first. What's driving the condition? Can we identify a viable target within the genetic component that we could develop a drug or an intervention that would have some type of benefit? We develop translational models to help us to test that idea. So that's what my colleagues at the table there, they are so rigorous, they are so dedicated to getting it right the first time, but they spend multiple hours going through the different studies, going through the translational analyses, really to then get us to the point we can get into the clinic. So that means getting into patients. each step along the way, we have these decisions to make. And so I think that what Praxis has done is really come up with a nice model to follow. But you can see at the bottom, there's the patient focus. And it's really the voice of the patient. And I think that's the one thing to consider is companies talk about the voice of the patient, but what we see at Praxis is that we actually incorporate the voice of the patient into what we do. And I'll show you some slides where that comes through, what that actually looks like. So when I talk about the process, I talk about looking at evidence-based decision-making, what that results in is we can create a couple platforms. We have a platform that is a small molecule platform, which will help with some of the symptomatic presentations. We also have a platform which is ASO-based, so antisense oligonucleotides, which could get into disease modification. But ultimately, as we have the people in the labs, we have the people in the clinics who are working hard, this allows us to create a very robust pipeline of potential drugs and potential treatments and interventions. And the one I want to talk to you about tonight is Prax562. It's a small molecule that has specific properties that we believe that would be beneficial to the SCN8A patient population. So as I mentioned before, the evidence tells us a story. And so what does the evidence tell us about 562? So first off, 562 is developed specifically in the pediatric population first. So what we've seen before is a lot of times drugs, back in my former lives, drugs would be developed in the adult population, they would get registered for adults, then you kind of work backward, right? And so you get good drugs, but they aren't specifically designed right off the bat. So what we have with Prax562, it's designed for pediatric use. So it means an oral formulation, J-tube, G-tube friendly, keto friendly. You have a molecule that will really get to the root issues that you have with some of the voltage within these patients. So NaV 1.6 is the one in particular that we really focus on in the persistent current. So what we've noticed and what we've really gleaned from the data and from the evidence using 562, both in the preclinical models, is it seems like there is a preference for disease-specific channelopathy. So what that means, essentially it's working on the channels that are malfunctioning. It's really focused on the NaV 1.6, which is problematic for the SCN8A patients. What we see is because it's working in that space and maybe not affecting the other normal channels as much, what we see then is really this opportunity for larger doses. We see higher dosing windows as compared to traditional sodium channel drugs. Because most of the time I kind of joke, you run out of drug before you run out of seizures with the old drugs. And so that's why you start seeing the polypharmacy, you see multiple different drugs being used at once because you just couldn't get where you need to go with the first one. And so what we've also noticed too is everybody's probably been through the sodium channel blocker usage, and it takes sometimes titration, 12 weeks to get to a dose that may or may not work effectively. What we see with Prax562 is you can start it at a therapeutic level immediately, and it has an auto titration function built in. What that means, you start at the dose you want and continue through, and then look at efficacy and look at the benefit to the patient. So that's different. Also has a long half-life. So a lot of times the drugs, you see drugs that are BID or TID dosing. Those are short half-life drugs, so in order to get the coverage and protection you need, then you have to use them multiple times a day. With Prax562, it should be one and done for the day. Which is also nice because like in my house we're on BID dosing, so you always worry somebody's watching your child, did they forget to give the dose in the evening? Like how sensitive are they to fluctuations? This I think gives you, hopefully you get the seizure control. This I always kind of like to joke and say you get the seizure cruise control, right? So you don't have as much to worry about should something happen. So we'll see if that bears out in the clinic, in the studies, but we're hopeful based upon the preclinical evidence that we would see something like that. So looking at the next phase, so we talked about the preclinical, and now we're talking about the phase 1 data. So there's a couple slides I geek out on, and there's one point on here that I really love, and I'll get to it in just a second. First off, Prax562 has been tested in healthy volunteers, so it's people with normal channel function who don't have SCN8A. And what we saw, well tolerated in about 130 patients that have been used. It's probably a little bit more at this point. But what was really interesting, and I think what was really, really important to me, is we didn't hit MTD. So MTD is maximum tolerated dose. So typically, in old sodium channel blockers, you would hit the ceiling, and patients would feel kind of this confusion, dizziness. They would feel like drunk, right, for lack of a better term. They would feel that. So what we didn't see is, as a monotherapy, we didn't hit that ceiling where they reached maximum tolerated dose. That's really important because that allows for that larger therapeutic window. So that's what we mean on the other slide, is you've got a little bit more ceiling than what you've seen before. And the engagement in some of the things like persistent NAV 1.6 occur much earlier in the dosing as opposed to having to dose really high to get that. Old sodium channel blockers didn't maybe have that same window between engagement and then a tonic block or the side effect creating block, if you will. What we noticed too is the adverse events for these patients, for these healthy volunteers, were really mild. Overall, they resolved once they stopped the medication. And again, these are healthy volunteers who are going to be much, much more sensitive to the side effects of a drug than the children with the SCN8A variant that causes channelopathy. Because as you know, you've probably had to dose traditional drugs very high and haven't seen the benefit you're looking for. So we're looking at these doses at very high levels in the healthy volunteers, but still not reaching that MTD. And also the question becomes is if you don't see a lot of side effects, is the drug actually working? And so what we were able to do is confirm via EEG that we had engagement in the target organ. So we did see changes in EEGs in these healthy volunteers. So all those things line up to be positive. So that allows us to move into the next phases of drug development. And so I love this slide because I know in the past, I've done some fireside chats, I've done some webinars. It's much easier to do webinar than it is to be here in person. But that being said, where we are now with the development of the product is we're dosing patients. So not just enrolling, not just coming soon, because we've said that in the past and sometimes you get delayed. But now we're in the clinic, we're in patients, and we're coming to the tail end of enrollment. So we have a majority of the patients, we have a few more opportunities. So I wanted to present that to the families tonight as if you're interested, if you hadn't heard about it, if you weren't familiar with it, there's the trial QR code that you can actually sign up. There's a nurse navigator who will talk through the process with you. But wanted to give you the opportunity to participate if you're interested, but also then to share the exciting news that we are dosing, patients have the drug on board, and that we're moving through the clinical trial with results should be beginning part of next year, so the first half of next year. The other thing too I wanted to highlight, and this was interesting. So having done drug development for a long time and clinical designs for a long time, this is the first time I've had this particular experience in a clinical trial. So we talk about flexibility, and as I mentioned with my son, his needs are different than some of the needs here. One size doesn't really fit all, but used to be, and I say used to be because I think now this will be the new trend, it used to be that there was only one way to get into the trial. You had to go to the site. You had to travel to the site. You had to spend, oh my gosh, I don't know how many hours. John probably knows how many hours people have to spend in the sites. But now you have the opportunity to not have to do that. And this became important to us because when we looked at who was going to be in the trial, so we're looking at these patients who are 2 to 18 years old, who have 8 seizures per month, who have a variant, an SCN8A variant, and then also who are taking no more than 1 sodium channel blocker. So we're like, okay, let's get these patients into the clinic. But what happens is, as you talk to families and as you talk to groups like TCSF, you hear the voice of the patient loud and clear to say, I try, I want to help you, I want to be in the trial. I don't know if I can. So we're like, okay, let's see what we can do. So we begin to modify the protocol in a way to say maybe it's every other visit that you have to come in. So it's better, right, and it's an opportunity. But still not quite good enough, right? Because it's really hard to travel. It's hard to travel with children. It's hard to travel then with children with epilepsy and the challenges that come along with that. So it really said to us, is there something we can do differently, do better, that nobody else has done before, in a way that no one else has done it before, to get drugs to market that nobody else has gotten to market? So that is where we came up with the idea of the DCT. You probably heard DCT thrown around. That means decentralized clinical trial. So what that means is, as a family, you don't have to come to the clinic. So if you want to do it at home, we'll come to you. We'll bring a neurologist to your house. We'll bring a nurse to your house to gather blood, to do the assessments you need, to keep eyes on the patient to see how they're doing, to help them through the process. Now, if you want to, you could go to the clinic. And if you want to have a hybrid, you could go to a clinic. So I kind of joke, this is like the old choose your adventure books, where you're like, if you want to do this, go to this page. So it's a bit like that, because we understand, and as we dug deeper into it and talked more with families, everybody has different needs. And so clinical trials should be able to adapt and be able to work within, the needs of the families. And so we talk about it that this is the first time that we've seen in epilepsy where you could do this at home. And so, talking with people like John Schreiber, who had mentioned, like, it's hard for kids to travel, it's hard for these type of things for the families, that input is valuable because it comes from the clinical trial experts, it comes from the families, it comes then, all the way through our meetings internally, and then we say, can we do it? And so a lot of times the answer in pharma is like, oh, you could, it's gonna be really hard, we don't know how to do it necessarily, and so companies tend to stop. And they say, well, we won't do it, we'll just do as normal, just as everything. But Praxis is different, and I have to applaud them in so many ways, because they said, let's try it, let's figure it out, can we solve that? And so Praxis is not a large company. We're a relatively small company, but we have people, again, like the folks sitting in the other table, who are really innovative thinkers, who are really outside the box thinkers. And so then we set out to make this decentralized, to give the patients an opportunity. And what that did is it changed the way we can enroll studies. So we could do informed consents remotely. We could have the families do everything at home and make the burden at least one less piece that the families had to go through. So what that did, so when you look at the sites that we do have, because again, talking about a hybrid model, we have sites across the US. The 3 sites are listed there. We've got one in Atlanta, one in Boston, and then we've got the other one that is in Chicago. So families have this option of going to different locations. We also have a site in Spain, and so what we did is we did the same thing, DCT in Spain. So when you look at it, the regulatory headaches that this creates and the international laws and those type of things that it creates, I have to say is well worth it. So when you have to solve for it and what this actually means, because there were so many families that are within the EU who are like, absolutely, could you make this possible? Like, and they would come up and, it's tough when you're at meetings because like, can you help us? I'm like, well, let me see what we can do. And so what we were able to do is grow that footprint virtually. So it doesn't mean we have to have 20 sites in the EU to be able to do the trial. We just need one within the EU who's willing to embark on this journey and this adventure with us. And we have one in Spain and Ruber, and they've been great to work with. They've been very willing to help us along the way. And so what that ends up meaning is we had patients in Poland, we had patients in Lithuania, we had patients in Germany and Italy and France, who are all interested, Denmark, all interested in who can be in the trial, who before there would be such a hurdle to them getting there. Because I remember a mom told me, she said, so we'll get on a boat, we'll go take a 3-hour boat ferry across to get to the site. And I was like, oh my gosh, I just imagine that. It's like, I've traveled on a boat, I've traveled on a ferry for multiple hours, and it's like probably one of the worst ways to go. But if you're willing to do that, then let me see what I can do to help you even further. So setting this decentralized trial up in Europe had been like just an amazing moment for us, because it helped us to get families connected. And all these things are important because it allows us to give that flexibility and inclusion into a trial that a lot of these patients would never have the chance to be in. Because what I've always found is you're really in clinical trials and certain conditions, a lot of patients were excluded not because they couldn't benefit from the product, but they couldn't be in the trial, they just couldn't get there. So the sickest or most affected patients were the ones who were excluded just for the sake that they had a worse phenotype. And so that for me is tough, because that's the patient you want to help, and that's the patient who could benefit, and we just had a system that didn't really fit what their needs were. So this was the first time I've seen us to solve that, and really wanted to share that with everybody, share it with other industry sponsors, other industry folk, so they can see this, because it is a great option for patients who are much more severely affected. So what we did too is like with that flexibility, so being able to include those patients who normally wouldn't be able to be in the trial, but giving them the flexibility to do it on their terms, how they wanted to do it, I think was important. So you could start out in the clinic and say, hey, I want to move this to home. You could start out at home and say, hey, I want to move to the clinic. You have this optionality to go back and forth, and we could adapt the trial to the way that they needed. But one of the things that we looked at is, how do we leverage technology? Could we get EEGs at home? Could we get devices that would monitor nocturnal seizures? Could we get EKGs that could be done at home that were at the same level? And the answer is yes. It took a lot of meetings, but the answer was yes. And so then I think this is really, for me, like that moment where it really makes sense of how to partner better with families. Instead of saying, how do you help us? It's how do we help you? So that kind of brings us to this, just to recap drug development and how this works. And we always want to get there faster. And again, there's a Praxis mantra. We want to do it as faster than anybody else has done it. And so how do we do this? And how do we do this together? Because I think that's the important piece that always has to be considered, is we can set up the trials and we can get everything in place, but we need clinicians, we need families who are willing to go on that journey with us. And so all of those things are what accelerates drug development. So the faster we can enroll a trial, the faster we can get to yes, no, the faster we can get the data that we're looking for. And so then you can see all the way from early discovery, then into the phases. The faster we can move through each one, the faster we get the drug to market and get it to more patients. So I wanted to highlight that because without you, it doesn't happen for us. And I just, again, want to say thank you for the families who have shown interest, for the families who have been willing to slug it out with us in those daunting tasks of getting these things solved, to the foundations like TCSF for everything that you guys have done to help the families get connected with the information they need. I couldn't thank you any more than that. I mean, it's a phenomenal job you've done. But here is the link, if you will, to how do you guys get involved if you're interested. Again, this is the pre-screener piece that gets you connected with the site, and we can get you screened for potential inclusion into the trial. So in summary, again, we're dosing, which is great, because I've told people a number of times coming soon. So we should have data relatively soon, which is good. Still a few slots open for the study. So if you're interested, please sign up. And then again, DCT is really this key component that I think we'll see continue at Praxis, that will continue in through the next phases into registration as well. So with that, I'd like to say thank you again. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions.
I forgot to mention, we do have a microphone that we can hand across. Does anybody have any questions for Brian before we move on to our next speaker? If not, Brian will talk your ear off about the science afterwards. So feel free to catch him at dinner or after the event, and I know he would answer your questions. Brian, thank you so much for coming tonight, and thanks Praxis for your continued support and your innovative thinking when it comes to our 8A kids. I would now like to introduce Marianne Sutcliff. Marianne is the mother of SCN8A warrior Brianna and serves as secretary of the TCSF's board of directors. So due to Brianna's unpredictable health at the moment, Marianne wasn't even sure if she was going to make it tonight until this morning. So we were prepared, and Marianne made a video of her family talk this year. So just in case she couldn't make it, but she is here. So say hi, Marianne. So glad that you were able to make it. So if you guys want to go ahead and start Marianne's video.
My name is Marianne Sutcliff. My youngest daughter, Brianna, was diagnosed with an SCN8A mutation at 11 months, and I think Brianna's story will resonate with many of you. Brianna didn't have seizures at birth, but she did come into this world pretty roughly. She was born face up, so she was pretty beat up when she came out, and it took her over a week to look like our baby and heal. Pretty early on, Brianna was diagnosed with low tone and torticollis, and so we started her in PT at 4 months. Despite some already evident challenges in her development, Brianna was a super happy baby and already bringing us joy. At 5 months, Brianna had her first seizure. It was actually the first night she slept in her own room. We had a baby monitor in her room, and around midnight, I heard her making some noises. I went in, and she was awake. Her eyes were wide open and staring. Her arms were stiff and shaking. I tried to rouse her, but I couldn't for several minutes. I'd never seen a seizure before, so that didn't immediately come to my mind. The next morning, around 6, the same thing happened, and this time seizures did enter my mind. As soon as the pediatrician's office opened, we took her in, and unlike many doctors, he didn't need to see the seizures himself to know that we should go to the ER. So we did. We went to the local community hospital. Brianna had another tonic-clonic in the ER, luckily, and they rescued her with phenobarb and admitted us. She went through the battery of tests, and of course we found nothing. And as is common with most of our kids, they put her on a daily phenobarb regimen and sent us home after a couple days. Brianna's seizures were controlled for about a month on phenobarb. Sounds familiar, right? All the seizures were tonic-clonic, several minutes, requiring rescue, and sometimes requiring the ER. The doctor now wanted to add triliptal, and I started looking for a second opinion and an epileptologist, which brought us to Lurie Children's in Chicago. At 11 months, we had genetic testing for Brianna, and we received the SCN8A diagnosis. And I want to thank many of you right now for sharing your stories with me and helping me to understand, what was going on and how to manage through all of this. Now, right around a year, as is common, Brianna's triliptal dose was increased pretty significantly, and we were then able to wean her off of the phenobarb. And the seizure stopped, thank God. So now that the seizures were under control, we could focus even more of our efforts on Brianna's development. So Brianna was in upwards of 13 therapies a week. She was a really hardworking little baby. And despite all the work it took to coordinate and plan all of those activities, we could still live a pretty normal life. We could go on outings. Brianna could interact and play with her sister in a number of different ways. And we could travel some as well. And we were at a point where we reached 5 years of seizure freedom. I almost felt guilty sometimes interacting with some of the SCN8A families because I would say we were one of the luckier families going through this. And Brianna sometimes, I think, became a beacon of hope for some of the younger kids. But last summer, I decided to retire after a long career in pharma, and I really wanted to spend more time with the kids and spend more time focused on the things that needed to happen for Brianna's development, finding her the right school, et cetera. And frankly, I was just tired managing all of that and trying to work full time. Turned out to be a great decision because as of last fall, Brianna's seizures were no longer under control. She started having a different type of seizure this time. She started having focal seizures, about 15 seconds, under 15 seconds each, but they clustered a lot. And, so she was in status pretty often. So for the next couple months, we spent most of the time either in the ER, or at the hospital. Brianna missed Halloween. She missed Thanksgiving. But we were running tests. We were trying new drug combos. We were trying to get everything to get her back under control. Increased triliptal, bridge clonazepam to the point where it became a chronic med, add Epidiolex, add Onfi, try Depakote, take Depakote off because of the side effects. Rescue, add Vimpat, switch Vimpat to zonisamide. She's in status. Do we intubate? We tried keto, but after about 3 months, we had to take her off because she was throwing up all the time and her body just couldn't process. She regressed pretty much during this time as well. She, had a period of time where she could no longer stand, and Brianna's a walker at this point. So that was really scary. It was a really rough time for Brianna and for our family. But we finally tried a triliptal to carbamazepine switch, and that seemed to work. So right before Christmas, we went home And the carbamazepine worked for about a month into January, and then she was having seizures again. So we switched carbamazepine to Aptium and began the process of experimentation again. So for most of 2023, Brianna has had seizures for most days. She does have some periods here and there where she doesn't have any seizures. And luckily we haven't needed to rescue her for since August. She's now on 4 meds and very fatigued. She missed more than half of first grade and is now at a private special education school. We're no longer comfortable traveling more than a couple of hours from home. And, you know, we don't feel comfortable being on a plane at this time as well, but we still try to have fun, and life is just different now. You know, we're back to experimentation, and we, like all of you, won't stop looking for answers and trying to find solutions. And we're grateful for every day with our little cutie and celebrate every inch-stone. So appreciate you listening. If you ever have any questions and are going through anything similar, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Take care.
Story. I know the last year has been really rough for you, and we've been holding you really, really close to our heart. I would now like to introduce Liz Ramirez. Liz is the mother of SCN8A Angel Will and serves as TCSF Executive Committee's Bereavement Support and Grants Advisor.
Good evening, SCN8A community. My name is Liz Ramirez, and I'm a volunteer with the Acute Syndrome Foundation. We are at the point in our program now where we take time to honor, remember, and miss our loved ones we've lost to SCN8A. My son Will died of SUDEP in 2017 at the age of 7. This year, we've decided to approach our Memorial Moment slideshow a little differently. The difficult reality is that with the large and constantly growing number of children we've lost to this disorder, the memorial video had become really long. So for this year, we've grouped our children by year of passing, and we will highlight those we've lost since last year's gathering. At the Acute Syndrome Foundation, the children we've lost in our community are always guiding the work that we do, and we are engaging in ongoing efforts to honor those whose lives were taken by SCN8A. With a virtual memorial wall on our website to keep their memories alive. There are cards on your tables with information about how to view this. I want to take this moment to underscore a reality that every caregiver, parent, and sibling in this room knows all too well. That death isn't the only significant loss that comes with an SCN8A diagnosis. We experience the loss of dreams for our children to lead healthy lives. We struggle as we come to grips with what this means for their siblings' lives and futures. We see the toll that being a caregiver takes on our physical health, mental health, our relationships, and we somehow learn to live in a landscape of heartache as we watch our children suffer and face constant setbacks. SCN8A is a devastating disorder in both life and death. So I want to give a special thanks to the clinicians and researchers who have joined us this evening, taking the time out of their busy schedules. Your work makes a significant difference in our lives. Thank you. In light of all of these tough realities, the Acute Syndrome Foundation has been working to develop targeted social, emotional, and mental health programming focusing on common experiences in our community, such as loss, bereavement, and anticipatory grief. While we unfortunately can't change our circumstances, it makes such a difference to receive meaningful support during the journey. I am personally so grateful that this community is a group of people who have come alongside my family and me to always remember and miss Will. Now, please join me in honoring and remembering those we've lost to SCN8A with this video. Thank you.
In the face of SCN8A, we have encountered profound challenges that have tested the limits of strength and endurance for our community. It is with a mix of grief and determination that we acknowledge the loss of these 60 precious children. Each one leaves a permanent mark on our hearts, reminding us of the urgency and gravity of the work that we do. It is during these moments of vulnerability that the true strength of our community emerges. Families supporting families, clinicians providing unwavering care, and researchers relentlessly seeking answers, and industry partners paving the way for new treatments. We stand united in the face of adversity. In recognizing the challenges, we must also celebrate the triumphs, no matter how small. Each step forward, every breakthrough, and the resilience displayed by our community members are beacons of hope. The spirit of unity that binds us together becomes a source of inspiration, motivating us to press on despite the obstacles. During our dinner break, I encourage you to pause and view the rotating slideshow, which showcases some of the noteworthy celebrations, including our wonderful Connor James Smith Patient Assistant Grant recipients, and how it's time to eat. So we will continue with presentations in approximately 30 minutes. Enjoy your dinner, and we'll come right back here. Hello, everyone. Okay, we have 5 minutes left of dinner, but as we're finishing up our food, we have a few announcements. Okay, so the first announcement is that we have a silent auction currently going on, and all the proceeds of TCSF's silent auction will go to the Dr. Mandy Harris Travel Grant. we were able to award 28 families a travel grant to help cover travel and lodging to get here. So we are so proud of that. Yes, amazing, right? So happy to be able to do that. And in order to continue to do that each year, we have the virtual silent auction. A huge thank you to Danielle Hayward, who organized all that, and Marianne Sutcliff also helped out. And so we really, really appreciate all they've done. So how will you bid on the silent auction? We have all of those items at the very front, kind of across from the registration table. And there's QR codes where you can go in there and bid. The bidding will stop tomorrow at noon, so you have some time. We also have all of that on our social media too, but there's some really, really cool packages. Okay, so I am going to introduce Dianely Cabrera. She is a TCSF volunteer, and she's actually, where's she at? There she is. Okay, good. I was like, oh no. She is going to tell us about a really fun and exciting announcement for 2024. So come on up, Dianely.
All right. Hi, everyone. Sorry, I'm reading from my phone. As Kacie mentioned, my name is Dianely Cabrera, and I'm the proud mom to Max. He was here earlier, but he was kind of upset about being around a lot of people, so we had to take him back to the room. I hope some of you got to meet him. First, I would like to thank the CUTIES Syndrome Foundation for everything they have done for this community. Thank you for giving our kids a voice. Now, did you know Max prefers his dad over me? It's a true story. When he's crying about something and I give him love and kisses and hugs, get nothing, right? Dad walks in with one word and he gets a huge grin from Max and giggles and laughs and like, oh yay, Dad's here. Thanks, Max. Did you know the majority of us parents here today had a dozen or so breakdowns or panic attacks? Is this trip too much for my child? Should I be leaving my child behind? What if something happens while I'm away? Am I going to forget to bring something important for them? Am I a bad parent? Did you know there have been times where the pressure of being a special needs parent, watching your child crying, seizing, desadding for the 20th time in one night, and it's just too much, you debate grabbing your car keys and just leaving? Did you know Max's brother is going up to be one of the most amazing human beings I've ever met? Around last year, he started asking more questions about Max. A lot of whys. Then one day he told me, Mama, I want to be an inventor when I grow up. I want to invent a time machine to where I could go in the future, get the cure, and bring it back to Max and his friends so they could be cured. He's 7 years old. There are some things we wish others knew when we say we're okay. It's not to say we don't have good days. It's not to say we don't love our kids. But it's important for the world to know the good, the bad, the ugly, and sometimes even the funny. So, for the 2024 Awareness Day theme, we would like to announce the new hashtag will be, If You Only Knew. The CUTIES Syndrome Foundation is encouraging families to share a part of their life they wish others knew about. The good, the bad, the ugly, and yes, the funny. Thank you.
Tomorrow we have a videographer here, and we're really excited for them to capture our kids just the way they are in all of their times of struggles, but also their happy times. And I wanted to say thank you to Dianely because it was her idea. She was like, hey, we should do this. And we're going to interview some family members tomorrow as well to get the word out and spread awareness. And Dianely put that all together, and I really, really appreciate that. So stay tuned for some really, really cool footage. Okay, so whenever we were on break, we had a really good question from the audience pop up, and I realized that I failed to mention that we also have a virtual audience, and so we highly encourage those at home to ask questions in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we will make sure that those questions are asked live here. So Liz, if you want to go ahead and read out that question, and I believe it's for Brian with Praxis. So, and then put you on the spot here. See if you guys want to shed some light on that question.
Thank you, Kacie. So the question from one of our virtual attendees is, for the Prax 562, would there be another phase to the trial in the future after the initial group of 10, as that is a very small N size to determine efficacy across diverse patient populations?
Yeah, so essentially what we'll do in this proof of concept study, there'll be 20 total, so there would be approximately 10 2A and 10 8A. So we'd be able to pool those data to look at that response. The drug also works on NAB 1.2 for the 2A patients. So we would look at that data, make a decision, could we move forward, and then there would be phase 3, which would be a registrational trial, and then we would open that back up for additional enrollment and continue that way.
Thank you, Brian. And yeah, those viewers at home, please keep those questions coming. All right, it is now time for the clinician panel. So I would like to introduce Dr. John Schreiber, the Director of Epilepsy Genetics Program and EEG at Children's National Hospital. Dr. Schreiber will be presenting quality of life and SCN8A related epilepsy, and then he's going to be the moderator for this panel and introduce each clinician in the clinician panel. So Dr. John Schreiber.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. As always, I really enjoy these meetings, a chance to meet families and talk with other people who are just engaged in this great work. So pleasure to be here again. I'll talk about work here that was done mostly by a resident at Children's National Hospital that I work with, looking at quality of life and how that can be a marker we can use to find out more about how our kids with SCN8A related epilepsy are doing. Quality of life, as we've heard a lot about tonight, encompasses so much, right? It's not just the seizures. There's so much that's involved in quality of life. The definition of quality of life is the degree of daily functioning and the perception of living a fulfilling life. And there's so many things that can contribute to that, right? So it encompasses not only the disease state, but also function, other comorbidities, psychiatric, cognitive, behavioral things. And the issue is it can be hard to measure, especially in people with developmental disabilities. There's several different kinds of quality of life measures that are out there. There's those that focus on epilepsy, those that focus on pediatrics. But one that we looked at and used was developed by Jenny Downs and has been used more and more in kids with various forms of developmental disorders, including Down syndrome, Rett syndrome, autism, and a number of other things. So we'll talk about some of that. What the QI disability evaluates are several different domains of quality of life, things that it encompasses social interaction, physical health, independence, independent living, positive emotions, negative emotions, so these good and bad behaviors, and then leisure and outdoors, fun activities outside. We've seen lots of pictures. I was thinking about this as I'm seeing some pictures of some of your kids today about how important these things are to their overall quality of life. So the study was conducted all remotely, living in the age of COVID now and Zoom. Is one nice thing about that is it has enabled a lot more participation, and as Brian was saying, more inclusion for people who maybe can't travel to a site. So we had 19 participants with epilepsy and known SCN8A pathogenic or likely pathogenic variants, 10 who had participated previously in our multidisciplinary clinic. We got information about their clinical history, the quality of life, inventory disability, and then the Vineland. Many of you may be familiar with the Vineland, but the Vineland adaptive behavior skills are a very common measure that we use really to assess overall development, but it actually measures adaptive behavior. So what we hypothesized was the QI disability would show more variability than the Vineland in SCN8A, particularly in the kids with on the more severe end of the spectrum. And I'll show you some of this data, but what we find is for the Vineland that there's a floor effect. And many of you may know this if you've done this. There's a lot of things that the Vineland just doesn't really capture, the range of what kids with some of the more severe phenotypes are able to do. And we also wanted to secondarily just explore the associations of development, epilepsy phenotype, other seizure-related factors that were associated with quality of life. So these are the characteristics of our patients. You can see we had a pretty good range in age, decent mix of male and female, and then we divided them according to epilepsy phenotype. And there's now the self-limited, what's called self-limited focal epilepsy. Now we know it's probably not so self-limited. Mild to moderate developmental and epileptic encephalopathy, the more severe form of DEE, and then kids with neurodevelopmental disabilities with generalized epilepsy that probably, as we know, and as Joshua Hack will talk about a little bit later, it probably represents more of a loss of function. We have kids that are seizure-free, up to those that are having daily seizures. There's one on no anti-seizure medications, and there's some on up to 4 or more anti-seizure medications. You can see several of these kids also have other comorbidities that require enteral feeding tubes, and some are able to, about half can ambulate, and about half either have some sort of walking assisted device or are non-ambulatory. So here's our results. So you can see that the epilepsy phenotype and quality of life, there were significant associations there. So, and actually as the quality of life score goes up, that's the better quality of life correlates with a higher score. So you can see here that the milder epilepsy phenotypes are indeed associated with improved quality of life. We also see that's true for developmental scores overall. So if you look at your Vineland score, that also does tend to correlate with quality of life. If we looked at some of the other factors, though, and one thing that stood out to us was that an increased number of anti-seizure medications actually correlated with overall quality of life. And then if you looked at each subdomain, there were statistically significant correlations there with multiple different domains of quality of life. So health and well-being, positive emotions, family and friends, and daily life. Whereas seizure frequency, what we're trying to use these anti-seizure medications to treat was only associated with overall health and well-being and daily life. So not some of these other things so much as you can see with anti-seizure medications. And what that says to me is that maybe more medicines is not always the right thing. Sometimes it's not just more medicines, it's the right medicine, and that's one of the things we're talking about today, right, is to try to find new and better therapies. But this tells me it's just as important to take a medicine off as it is to put a new medicine on, and maybe more important, actually, based on these results. Just to show you the Vineland according to age, the graph on the left is what we had reported initially a few years ago, that the Vineland scores are lower in people who are higher in age. It looks like it's decreasing. This is a cross section, so this is not longitudinal, and you're not seeing this over time. And we didn't know if the reason why it looks like those are decreasing are because kids are falling further behind their age-matched peers, if they are actually having some decline, or if we're just the more severely affected kids are tend to be older because those are the kids in whom you're going to have that more extensive genetic testing, whereas we're doing more and more genetic testing on patients with epilepsy these days. What we're finding is there are kids who are, a higher proportion of kids are probably more mildly affected as well. And then we did repeat the Vineland in a few patients here. This was just sort of exploratory, and found that in general things were pretty stable. One thing you'll notice is that there are patients who are in that more severe category tend to stay at that lower range of the Vineland. Last thing I want to show you here is that if you look at the Vineland, this is kind of a busy slide, but these are all the subdomains, the different domains of the Vineland. You'll notice that the developmental and epileptic encephalopathies, there's clearly a floor effect here. So this is graphed, the Vineland scores according to age, and you can see the DEEs, the most severe phenotype, they tend to be on that lower end of that of the Vineland, and that's what you see is this floor effect. It's not capturing the range of symptoms of development in kids with the more severe form of SCN8A. And whereas the QI disability, you do see a lot more variation in quality of life. So I think that this may be, quality of life in SCN8A related epilepsy is measured by this QI disability, is associated with epilepsy phenotype, seizure frequency, development, comorbidities, and number of anti-seizure medications, which actually is seemingly associated with more subdomains in quality of life. The Vineland scores appear stable over time. There's a floor effect in the more severe form of DEE, whereas the QI disability shows greater variability in that DEE phenotype. So that's all. I just want to thank especially Dr. Vivian Z, who's a neurology resident / fellow at Children's National. She's going on to not epilepsy, unfortunately. She's going to do a neuroimmunology fellowship, but she's wonderful. Madison Burrell, many of you know, she's runs neuropsychology and epilepsy at Children's National, and then a research coordinator, Zach Kramer. This is supported by the SCN8A Alliance, Motivated for MAV, and just want to thank all the participants in this study for sharing their time. Thank you. We have a couple minutes for questions, I think. And I have a microphone, so I don't know. Oh, am I the only one with a microphone? Here.
On that study, are you saying that the DEEs were the worst performing across all of those with all the medications the kids are currently on? Could you use that as a measure for your clinical trial, that if you can get off the floor? I mean, I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how do you use this information?
Yes, I think that's the key question, and that's one thing. I mean, the Vineland is being used in all sorts of clinical trials, not just for SCN8A, but for really any sort of DEE out there. And I think that's what we're running to in some cases, is that there is this floor effect with the Vineland, where I do wonder if will you see improvement on the Vineland, or do you need something else that maybe shows a little more variation? But that's my concern.
Dr. Schreiber, we have another question from a virtual attendee. How could we determine if there is causality in terms of the seizures leading to QI or QI leading to seizures?
Sorry, say it again.
If
seizures leading to?
Seizures leading to QI or QI leading to seizures.
I'm not sure if I understand the question, but so quality of life does appear to be associated with seizure frequency. So the question, I suppose, then is, could other factors in someone's life, things like sleep, things like their other, illness and everything, then contribute to seizures? The answer is most assuredly yes. I mean, there's several different things that can also then feed back onto seizure frequency. So this is one thing we address in the clinic. If you have a child who's not sleeping at all, let's say you put them on a medicine that keeps them up, or prevents them from falling asleep, or keeps them too sleepy, and they have seizures that are very tied to sleep, then the right answer might be to fix that problem and adjust those medications or pull back on something.
Yeah. Thank you. And another question from a virtual attendee. Did you separate each participant by their specific medications?
We didn't look at separate medications. We just weren't powered to be able to do that.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much. And we'll have some time, I think, later for questions too. Is that off? No, it's on. Okay. So I'd like to welcome up to the stage, as these slides get ready, Dr. Jillian McKee and Jan Magielski. I hope I'm saying that right. Excellent. So they are both from CHOP, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, working with their ENGINE, their neurogenetics program, and just doing some excellent work there. So I know Dr. McKee works a lot on SYNGAP, but I'm very happy she's also working on SCN8A, and very excited to hear about their work there. Okay, would you take over?
I'm assuming. All right. Thank you guys so much for inviting us here to talk. Jan and I are really excited to share some of our work that's currently ongoing into SCN8A and trying to get a good understanding of the natural history and how phenotypes change over time. So our research goals are to use phenotypic science and data integration from multiple different sources to help better understand disease trajectories over time. We want to identify unique features to SCN8A compared to other pediatric epilepsies, and then explore genotype and phenotype correlations, such as loss of function versus gain in function, and then look at specific recurrent variants. And then we also want to assess medication response and comparative effectiveness. So how we're approaching this is by combining data from 3 separate sources. So we have data from collaborators at the Danish Epilepsy Center. Then we're also using the Citizen database, as well as patients we follow locally in our CHOP cohort. And we are leveraging the human phenotype ontology, which I'll describe in more detail in a minute, to help assign clinical terms to each individual across all time bins over time, and then performing some computational analyses to get a sense of how disease trajectories change. And then we're also reconstructing seizure histories and then looking at medication comparative effectiveness. So my mentor, Ingo Helbig, likes to show this slide towards the beginning of a lot of his talks, just to give everyone a sense of the immensity of data that's available in the electronic medical record. This is showing you over 1 million neurology notes for over 100,000 patients and covers over 120,000 patient years. So one problem when you have all this data is you need really good, rigorous approaches to organize the data, analyze the data to help you make conclusions. So there's many different approaches you can take when you're facing this problem, and none of them are perfect. It's always a trade-off between sample size and granularity of the data. And one way we're trying to address this is by integrating data from 3 different sources. So if you look at this figure, the ideal would be to have an infinite sample size with perfectly detailed granular data, but obviously that's not feasible. And then samples where you have very restricted data on only a few patients are not really helpful. So most of the feasible approaches lie along this diagonal line. And so our data, we are looking at what I mentioned already, data we've been shared with us by our collaborators at the Danish Epilepsy Center, which is static data, meaning it's an overall snapshot of a patient's clinical picture at a single time point, but it has a large sample size. And then we're also looking at 2 longitudinal data sources, those provided by Citizen, which is large data medical aggregators, and then also our local cohort of patients at CHOP. And before I hand this over to Jan to go through some of our initial results, I just wanted to quickly discuss how we approach computational phenotyping. And we use the human phenotype ontology, which is a hierarchical ontology of clinical features. And as you can imagine in the electronic medical record, 2 different providers may be using different words to describe the same features. So someone may talk about generalized epilepsy in their clinic note, and then someone else may be describing the same feature in a more detailed way, talking about absence seizures, for example. And if you don't have a way to organize how clinical terms relate to each other, it can be really hard to figure out that those are actually describing the same thing and that those patients are actually quite similar. So we leverage the human phenotype ontology to understand how clinical terms relate to each other, and then we can calculate how similar patients are to one another.
Yes, so first let's...
The green one.
Is it this one?
The green one, the big green one.
Yeah. Sorry. So first, let's start with our overview of the static cohort. So we were able to gather over 350 individuals, with 220 individuals identified from previously published papers. As Jill said, this was done in help with a Danish epilepsy group, and in that cohort, in terms of variant breakdown, we saw the vast majority of individuals carried gain-of-function variants. Then we have 23 individuals with loss-of-function variants, and among the entire cohort, we have 247 de novo variants, whereas the other ones were either inherited or of undetermined inheritance. On the right, you can see the plot showing the frequencies of different phenotypes, and it comes probably as no surprise that individuals with SCN8A have a lot of seizures and neurodevelopmental and behavioral symptoms. Here on the slide, we can see how those variants are distributed along the SCN8A protein. We were able to identify quite a few recurrent variants, with the ones at position 1872, 1877, and 1475 with the highest counts. In terms of harmonization of clinical terms, so we first, these individuals were assigned HPO terms like Jill described, and after propagation to those higher terms, we were able to gather over 10,000 of them with average of 30 per individual. Next, we moved on to analysis of genotype-phenotype correlations. So first, we took a look at gain-of-function variants, and in the individuals carrying those gain-of-function variants, there were some features that were significantly more likely to occur than in the rest of the cohort. They included bilateral tonic-clonic seizures, focal onset seizures, and some of the movement-related symptoms like dystonia. Then you can see that in the other variant frequency portion of the graph, we can see, for example, that epileptic spasms were more likely for individuals who were not carrying gain-of-function variants. We did the same thing for individuals with loss-of-function variants, which was, as you can see, a much smaller n because it's much less prevalent in the cohort. And we see that the features here are quite different. So we see that they are more likely to have generalized onset seizures and absence seizures, as well as more of a behavioral phenotype with aggression or some personality phenotypes. Lastly, we took a look at two recurrent variants, and just to see how granular we can get with those associations. So we can see that the most recurrent variant at position 1872, which is a gain-of-function variant, we saw that it had some features that we previously saw on the gain-of-function graph, like bilateral tonic-clonic seizures or tonic seizures and motor-related symptoms. But we also saw that one of the prominent features was status epilepticus, which we didn't see on the graph of gain of function as a whole. In the 1877 position variant, even though it's gain of function variant, we see that it's quite different from what we just saw for 1872 variant. So we see that we have more of a behavioral phenotype. So we see aggressive behavior as well as incoordination and other different features that may be interesting to look at when we try to find more specific associations between different variants and different phenotypes. However, some features persist, like bilateral tonic-clonic seizures, which we saw on the previous slides. Then we went a step further and wanted to compare how SCN8A looks in comparison to another sodium channelopathy, SCN2A, and you can see that features that are under SCN8A are more likely for SCN8A, and they included the highest dot was related to expressive language delay, and those types of seizures that I mentioned previously, where SCN8A had more likelihood of generalized onset seizures as well as autism, among many other features you can see on the slide. To move on to longitudinal cohort, here you can see that thanks to the citizen data, we were able to aggregate over 162,000 phenotypic terms in 79 individuals. And on this graph, you can see it's the same graph that Jill showed at the very beginning of the talk, but specifically for SCN8A. So each line is a single individual, and each dot represents each clinical record that we can then track how those different clinical phenotypes change over time. And this is exactly what we did. So we looked at how those phenotypes progress over time. So you can see that red represents phenotypes present while blue absent. And you can see how it progresses over time with seizure, neurodevelopmental delay, and hypotonia being significantly prevalent across and regardless of age, while abnormality of digestive system, respiratory system, and sleep abnormality, which are also frequent symptoms in DEEs, we see that they may be a bit less frequent towards the later part of life, but we also want to underscore that based on the graph, you can see that we have much more data towards the beginning of life rather than later in life. So that's something to think about when looking at those results. Then we also looked at developmental milestones. It's SCN8A. So thanks to these data, we were able to assess how, what of the milestones kids with SCN8A are able to achieve. As you can see, based on the proportions on the right, we didn't. Not all individuals were assessed for all milestones. However, this gives us a good idea of what exactly children are able to achieve at which point of their life. And with that, I'll pass things over back to Jill.
So one common concern that many patients with SCN8A raise, obviously, is seizures, and when to expect seizure onset. And here we can use our static cohort from the Danish Epilepsy Center to look at, for individuals who have seizures, when do they start? So I'm showing you the cumulative seizure onset for all patients in blue, and then divide it up for gain of function in green and loss of function in red. And you can see that those with gain of function variants tend to have seizure onset that's earlier than loss of function. And then looking at seizure histories in more detail using the citizen data set. Here I'm showing the longitudinal seizure frequencies, similar plot to what Jan showed for the encounters, except now here each dot is a documented seizure frequency in the electronic medical record and coded by color, with darker reds being more severe seizures. And you can see again that seizure onset tends to be pretty early, but it's highly variable in severity across the lifespan. And then looking even more granularly at our local CHOP cohort, here I'm showing you how seizure frequency changes in monthly time bins for the first 3 years of life for individuals with SCN8A compared to those with two other genetic epilepsies, STX-BP1 and then SCN2A on the bottom. And here each vertical bar is a month, and it's broken down by the proportion of individuals with different seizure severities over time. And the connecting lines, if they're yellow, it means an individual's seizure frequency worsened from 1 month to the other, and if it's blue, it means it improved over time. Another source of data we can extract from the electronic medical record is seizure medicine prescription data. And here I'm just showing you the medication landscapes for 3 different genetic epilepsies. And you can see SCN8A there on the right. And you notice that the treatment strategies really do differ between these genetic epilepsies, which makes sense. You can see, notably for SCN1A, a lack of sodium channel medications and a lot of Depakote. And then for SCN8A, you see a lot of sodium channel blockers there. So once we have these detailed reconstructed seizure frequencies over time and then medication prescriptions over time, we can combine the 2 data sources to get a sense of which medications may be more effective. So what I'm showing you on the left is just a schematic of an individual's seizure frequency or seizure severity over time. And then on the bottom, all of the different medications they were on at different times. And what you can do is you can compare the time intervals when they had higher seizure frequencies to lower seizure frequencies and calculate an odds ratio for how effective different medications were. And what I'm showing you here is just for SCN8A and STXBP1, and you can see that the different medications have different effectiveness in these two conditions. Furthermore, this is just some very early pilot data. If you then break this down based on the actual biophysical consequences of the individual variants, you can do the same thing and get a sense of which medications may be more effective in individuals with variants that have different effects, different functional consequences on the channel. So with that, I'd like to thank our whole CHOP SCN8A team and then our collaborators at the Danish Epilepsy Center and then at Citizen as well. And then obviously want to thank the CUTIES Syndrome Foundation and Cure Epilepsy for helping support our research.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for a question or two. One question I have is how do you extract, there's a couple different data sets, how do you go about extracting all the HPO terms and then all the information about seizure frequencies and everything? Is any of that done?
So that's a great question. The Citizen data set is not in HPO terms, so we have to code them, and we've worked with those data sets a lot, so we've kind of created our own dictionary that we can use to help code them, but then there's always ones that are not coded that we have to manually review and look up the HPO term that's the best fit. And then the Citizen comes with seizure frequencies that are time-stamped. Our turtle cohort, we have to go through manually and reconstruct the monthly seizure frequencies.
Questions?
We have a question from another virtual attendee who asks, is there any research that investigates how clinicians from different medical specialties might categorize the same seizure video differently, highlighting the potential influence of their background and bias in diagnosis? And could we investigate that with your current data sets?
So that's a great question. It's not something we've been focusing on, but yeah, there's definitely people with different backgrounds may have different opinions of different videos. Videos tend to be really great. I love it when patients bring me videos because it's so much better if you can actually see what's happening, because the way people describe things, we use different words. So I think videos are probably more reliable than descriptions a lot of the time. But yeah, obviously, yes, people have variability in how they interpret things and how they would classify things.
Okay. Another one? Sure.
And another question from a virtual attendee. How do you account for dose when you are doing your medication analysis?
Great, that's a great question, and we haven't looked at that. It's something we should look at, but we haven't looked at that fine detail yet.
Hi. You classified some of your patients as having gain of function and some loss, but it looked like the majority weren't classified. Is that right? Are those just variants without a category?
Yes, so many of the variants are not known to have, what exactly their consequences. Some of them also had mixed effects that we haven't looked at yet because of, just the differences within that category of mixed effects. And also, we just did it based on the currently available, functional data, either from our collaborators or from this Phoenix, which is, a standardized dictionary for functional effects of mutations on channels. So, yeah, that's the reason.
And we have another question from a virtual attendee. Is there significant bias in age of patients when determining if certain medications lead to more effectiveness, e.g. older patients more severe, or a phenotypic outcome of a variant is not known for gain of function or loss of function?
So I don't think that age would bias those results, that just because of the fact that it's extracted from the clinical record. So however they're reported, if it's many per day or just a few per day or just a few a month, so it just classifies based on that. So the frequency of seizures feeds directly into the severity score that that Jill was showing on that plot with red dots and orange ones. So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, and next we have Joshua Hack. He's in the Hammer Lab, and I've had the pleasure of being able to work with Josh and Dr. Hammer now for a few years. And it's actually a good segue. He's going to talk about his machine learning to improve diagnosis, prognosis, and clinical management for SCN8A. So thank you so much.
Yeah, good evening. It's great to be here with all of you. I've had the wonderful opportunity to spend the last 3.5 years with Dr. Hammer at the University of Arizona, working with the data that many of you have provided us through the registry. And all of this is going towards trying to characterize SCN8A. And one of the big issues with SCN8A and with many complex diseases is we don't really know where to start with asking questions. And a great thing that the registry has allowed us to do is accumulate a source of big data, is what we're calling it. We collect data on pretty much the child's entire life history, their seizure frequency, seizure onset, development, medications. All of our modules are listed on the screen right there. And first and foremost, before I go any further, I want to thank everybody who has participated in it. Without all of the data that's provided in that registry, we wouldn't be able to, in turn, serve you with the developments that we've been able to make characterizing SCN8A. And so over the last year and a half, we've been able to make a lot of progress in characterizing the phenotypic landscape of SCN8A and the different subgroups within it based off of data provided by you. So one of the challenges with big data, in the case of the registry, we have about 8 million data points. Each individual that fills out the registry produces 20,000 data points for us, and we have about 400 individuals with a near complete registry profile. So standard approaches lead to a few problems with dealing with this data. Like I said, it is massive. We collect 15 modules of data, as I said, about 20,000 features for each individual, and this leads to pretty much two different problems. The first one being that it's really easy to miss important features and important identifying factors that are hidden within that massive amount of data. And so we really have to find a way to be able to parse through all of that data as quickly as possible to find real trends, real patterns that are being missed by us as researchers, by clinicians in their clinical settings. And the other issue with big data is that there's a massive time cost. It takes a lot of time to be able to get through all of that data in a way that is meaningful. And luckily, we already have a solution for that, and that is machine learning. And so all of the work that I will be presenting tonight is going to be based on our application of machine learning to the International SCN8A Registry. But first, just some background as to where we've come from. So what we traditionally thought is that SCN8A is a spectrum where loss of function exists on one end, and then you get into a gain of function gradient from mild to severe developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. In the last year, we've been able to develop a new model that really separates loss of function from gain of function while still keeping that gain of function gradient from mild to severe DEE. And this study was done primarily using data from the registry with some supplemental data from literature. And what we've come to is really three important questions, and that is, are there clinically distinct subgroups within this broad spectrum within the gain of function population? Can we predict an individual's disease progression and how likely they are to develop seizure freedom or be able to attain more progressed developmental milestones? And do subgroups exhibit distinct treatment response? So regarding this first question, like I said, all of this has been done using machine learning techniques applied to the registry. And we've been able to unveil a new understanding of the SCN8A landscape. And what we found is that the idea of SCN8A as a spectrum might be a little bit too simple. And so by using these machine learning techniques, we've really been able to expand our understanding of SCN8A, and we believe that it has significant implications for clinical management. And the machine learning process is described here along the bottom of the slide, where we're collecting that data, storing it in the registry. We're able to enrich it by supplementing some of that data with data from literature or through various other statistical methods, and then construct machine learning models to train and apply, and then eventually predict and visualize individuals within this SCN8A landscape. And that brings us to our second question: can we predict an individual's disease progression? And machine learning can be used to predict outcomes and classifications. There's a variety of methods to do that. And if you want more information on that, I get a lot more in detail on that on my SCN8A Unraveled interview. And using data in the registry, we've been able to construct 2 different machine learning models. One that is able to accurately predict whether an individual's variant has a gain of function or loss of function consequence with about 94% accuracy. And the second that is able to predict an individual's disease progression with about 96% accuracy. And the great thing about both of these models is that they use clinical features that are easy to diagnose early in a disease progression. So in theory, after the first appointment, once a child has gotten their genetic report and you see that SCN8A variant being reported as a likely cause for the disease, we're able to determine if it's gain of function or loss of function and provide some sort of prognostic outcome for that individual. And all of this data is supplied through the registry. It's all supplied by caregivers reporting it. The final question that we've been working on is, do subgroups exhibit distinct treatment responses? And the short answer of this is yes. We already know that's the case from loss of function and gain of function having differential responses to sodium channel blockers. And we believe that more patterns within the gain of function population can become apparent when we apply machine learning techniques with this specific goal in mind. And so really the end goal of this is to be able to provide precise treatment approaches that are individualized to a patient and their subgroup. And the great thing about science is that answering questions always prompts new ones. So our next steps and really the next questions that we want to answer are, how does SCN8A progress as an individual ages? And we'll be bringing in longitudinal studies and looking at data provided in the registry's annual updates. Can we incorporate results from medical tests to improve classification of individuals? And then, are there more categories that have yet to be discovered within each clinical subgroup? And will we be able to predict that based off of those same early life features? And once again, as an emphasis, all of this was accomplished using data that has been provided to us by you, the caregivers. So I'd like to wrap up with a huge thank you to everybody who has participated in the SCN8A registry research study. Without all of you, none of this would be possible. And really, it's because of you becoming a partner in advancing our science that we've been able to progress our understanding of SCN8A as much as we have over the last year and a half. And I'd like to thank SCN8A Alliance for all of their support and the team that I work with, Dr. Hammer, Dr. Watkins, Dr. Chung, and then Elise, our clinical coordinator, who deals with all of the emails and registry logistics, and then Karen, who is an undergraduate at the University of Arizona, who's started working with us looking at the registry data. If you'd like more information on the disease landscape that we are proposing and have gotten to a point where we feel comfortable changing, once again, our model. I have a poster that I'll be presenting tomorrow at the convention center from noon to 2, so feel free to stop by, and I'm more than happy to go into more detail. And as I said, if you want to learn more about the machine learning approaches, I have an interview on SCN8A Unraveled. So, thank you.
Time for a couple questions.
I have a virtual question, if I can. Wonderful work. Is this data available for other researchers to use?
Yes, they just have to reach out to us. We can provide de-identified data for whatever purposes. You just need to reach out to Dr. Hammer or myself.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Yep.
You said you have about 94% accuracy right now in predicting gain of function. versus loss of function. Is that, oh yeah, sorry. You said you have about 94% accuracy right now in terms of predicting gain of function versus loss of function. Is that queryable right now by a clinician or a family member with a specific variant to see?
Yes, through email. We can predict that with basically 5 features, and that is age at seizure onset, whether seizures are absence or non-absence seizures for their initial onset, the severity of their developmental delay, and the 5th feature being if they even have seizures. And I can run it through my model and can get a pretty confident answer from there, but it's not an online tool yet, but we're in the process of trying to make it accessible.
And this doesn't use anything to do with the actual variant itself.
Correct.
This is all based on clinical phenotype. Okay. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for all of those wonderful presentations. All right, now I would like to introduce Dr. Svetlana Shore, Director of Clinical Development at Neurocrine Biosciences, and Fiona Scott, Executive Director of Biology and Research, also at Neurocrine Biosciences, collectively presenting Neurocrine Biosciences research updates.
Thanks, Kacie. I'm a walker when I talk, so I'm going to use this microphone, and hopefully the video guy can keep up. Hi, everyone. So it's a real pleasure to be here with everyone tonight, and I really want to thank the TCSF organizers for having us here. I represent Neurocrine Biosciences, and my name is Fiona Scott, as already mentioned. I'm an executive director in the research side of the work we do at Neurocrine, and it's been a real honor to have had the chance to work on this project since we in-licensed this really interesting compound from Xenon Pharmaceuticals back in 2020. And it's been the most wonderfully both collaborative, collegial, productive, and enjoyable collaboration, and it's great to sit here with the Xenon colleagues. If it wasn't for JP Johnson, who most of you would probably recognize, maybe JP could stand up, who was really, really instrumental in discovering and pushing this molecule through early development. And you might recognize him from his really very unique and wonderful video through the SCN8A Unravel program, where he has his bespoke sodium channel, wooden whittled model, which I aspire to be as clever as JP, not only in understanding how sodium channels work, but not so much on the hirsuteness of the facial hair. Okay, so we'll go on to the next slide. And this is our disclosures. This presentation is really designed to be educational. 352, and this molecule was originally known as N901. It is now NBI 921352 if you're interested in looking up on ClinTrials, etc. And I'll refer to it as 352 for the rest of the talk. It is an investigational product, so not currently approved for sale or by any regulatory authority. And this presentation is really for educational purposes, intended to give you some insights into why we're inspired to keep progressing this molecule through clinical development, and why we think it's going to be of particular value for treating SCN8A DEE. Next slide. So we at Neurocrine have a pretty simple purpose, and that is to provide new therapies for patients with significant unmet need and who have not many options. And I think around this room, this is where we belong. This is actually the project that I'm most inspired by. I've worked on a lot of collaborations in my time at Neurocrine, worked on a lot of projects, but this one really, really touches for me. I have a young nephew in Australia who has a genetic mutation in a gene, and this mutation is even rarer than SCN8A DEE. And he's not doing so well right now, so for me, this project really touches my heart deeply. So yes, in Neurocrine, yeah, we're here to develop therapies for folks who really need it. Next slide. Here I'm showing you just a snapshot of our current clinical pipeline. Really just to give you an example of, or a demonstration of the deep bench that we have at Neurocrine. We have a deep bench that can not only discover new medicines, but can really progress those medicines through the necessary clinical development path to bring them to patients. We have just obviously in neuroscience, neuroendocrinology, and neuropsychiatry. The important pieces that I think we're really, really good at is taking molecules into phase 1, which is that first stage where you're testing in healthy volunteers whether your molecule has the kind of properties that you think are going to then be able to then benefit patients as you progress into phase 2. And phase 2 are those proof of concept studies that we run and are really, really critically important to be able to work out, do we have the right dose of the molecule? Do we have the right patient population? And that's where you'll see NBI 921352 or 352 currently sits. He's in a phase 2 trial right now for SCN8A DEE. And then we also have good, strong experience in progressing all the way through phase 3 and clinical and all the way through to commercialization. At Neurocrine, we have managed to not only discover, but fully develop a molecule or a medicine called Ingrezza, or valbenazine, for tardive dyskinesia, which is a movement disorder found in schizophrenia patients on antipsychotic drugs. And more recently, you'll see we have a molecule called crinecerfont in phase 3. We've just recently had some really amazing positive data in that patient population. This is another rare genetic disease that Neurocrine has been really committed to for quite a long time. And it really speaks to the tenacity of the clinical development organization that we have at Neurocrine. We were able to keep this project progressing all the way through the tough times that was running clinical trials during COVID, and managed to keep everything on track. And this was a trial both in adult population as well as pediatric kids with challenging conditions, much like your kiddos. Okay, next slide. So I'll get into the science now. I'm going to cover the mechanism of how 352 works as a very selective NaV1.6 blocker. And then Svetlana Shore, who is our clinical director on the program, taking it through clinical trials, will give you an update on the clinical trials that we've been running, not only in DEE, but also in our focal onset seizure studies. So 352 is really unique amongst the sodium channel blocker family and anti-epileptic drugs that you're familiar with. It really is the only one, both as a marketed product, well, it's the only sodium channel blocker amongst marketed products and products in clinical development right now that really only binds to NaV1.6. And it does this by binding to a really unique region that's separate from what's known as the pore domain. And I don't think do we have a pointer? Oh, look at that. So most sodium channel blockers bind to what's known as the pore domain. And this is obviously a very rudimentary example of a sodium channel compared to JP's very 3D dynamic model. But the PAM blockers, they tend to bind to this pore domain, which makes it near impossible to achieve selectivity. What Xenon did very elegantly was design this compound to bind to a unique domain out here on the outside of the channel known as the VSD4 domain. Because of this unique binding site, it locks the channel in what's known as this inactivated state, which is really very helpful if you're thinking about trying to block a channel that's overactive due to a genetic variation, such as is found in SCN8A DEE, or in overactive neurons that are driving seizures. So this is the kind of profile you want if you want to really control seizures very effectively. And that is the hypothesis of which we're building our clinical development paradigm. So if you go to the next slide. Oh, I can do it myself. Look at that. Okay, so how do we know it is a truly selective NaV1.6 blocker? It's because we can actually demonstrate that experimentally. So what you're seeing here on the far left is an experiment where, and this is actually, most of this data was actually generated by Xenon and can be found in this really cool publication down here. So if you take cells and you now make those cells express each individual kind of sodium channel available, you can start to do cool experiments where you ask whether your molecule can inhibit the action of those channels, and that's what Xenon did. This experiment is on the y-axis here, you have the number of channels, or the percentage of channels, that are now blocked by the drug. And on the y-axis here, you have the concentration of the compound. And so if we incubate these cells now expressing each different kind of channel with XEN901 or 352, you can see you get an increase in inhibition of those channels. And what's obviously quite striking for 352 is it really prefers this NaV1.6 this channel, NaV1.6 channel. Really doesn't do a good job of inhibiting the other channels, which is important when we think about the role those channels have in the body and in the brain. They're important for things like cardiac function with NaV1.5. They're important for inhibitory interneuron function, which are actually really critical for maintaining excitatory inhibition, homeostasis in the brain, and that's NaV1.1. So you don't want to hit NaV1.1 if you can. And if we do that same experiment now with phenotone or carbamazepine, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, you'll find if you get enough compound onto the channel such that it inhibits NaV1.6, you're also going to inhibit NaV1.1 and 1.5, etc. So this is a really unique profile. Importantly, we can also demonstrate that this molecule is just as effective at blocking channels that have a gain of function variant in them. So that tells us that in patients that actually have these variants in SCN8A, this molecule is still likely to block the activity of those channels. So super important. If you go to the next slide. Oh, gosh. Okay, so what are we doing here? Okay, yeah, all right. So the other point I want to make here is that not only is 352 really very selective, it's also really potent in inhibiting these inactivated channels. And so what you can see here in this left-hand panel is that if we again incubate the molecule with channels that have been forced into this inactivated state, they really, really are inhibited very effectively. Whereas those resting state channels, which are ready to be activated under normal conditions, are barely touched at all. And again, if you now compare 352's activity relative to those pan-sodium channel blockers, which are currently what your kids are sort of left with being able to access, this molecule is going to do it at much lower concentrations. So the idea here is we'll be able to have less drug on board to achieve the same kind of seizure control. And that's the experiment we're doing next, which of course is the clinical trials. And with that, one more. So how do we know that's important? Xenon was able to do a really elegant experiment and demonstrate that 352, when you treat mice with a gain of function variant, such as the N1768-2D mutation, which of course was one of those first described in Shay Hammer. When you now treat the animals with increasing doses of 352, we get beautiful reduction in seizures. And that reduction is dependent on not only the dose that's used, but also the concentration of the drug that can be measured in the brain of those animals. The fact that we can see the seizure reduction with a single dose is really exciting, but we can also continue to see seizure reduction after multiple doses. So when those animals were also treated for 7 days, you maintain seizure control, which is a really important piece as you're trying to develop new drugs. You want to make sure that your patients are not going to lose responsiveness over time. Now, we don't know if that's going to be the case clinically, but certainly in these animal models, it looks promising. Okay, and I think with that, we'll move it over to Svetlana. Do you want the mic or? You want the clicker?
I'll do it. I'm okay. I'm not a walker. I'm going to stay still. Hi, everyone. I'm Svetlana Shore. I'm the Director of Clinical Development for Neurocrine's pediatric epilepsy programs. And I'm going to finish us off with an update on our clinical side of things. So NBI 921352 is currently in 2 development programs at Neurocrine. One is in adults with focal onset epilepsy, and the other one is in SCN8A developmental and epileptic encephalopathy. We actually recently released the results of a phase 2 study in the adults with focal epilepsy, and unfortunately the study did not demonstrate meaningful seizure frequency reduction in those adults. However, we are continuing to investigate NBI 921352 in SCN8A DEE. That program is comprised of 2 studies. One is a randomized controlled trial and the other is an open label. On the top here, you can see the design of the randomized controlled trial. There's an 8-week screening period in which we collect baseline measurements from each participant's state and seizures and other markers. Then participants are randomized 50-50 split to either NBI 921352 or placebo. They titrate, in both cases, they increase their dose over the course of 6 weeks. That's the titration period. And then they will move to a 10-week maintenance period in which the dose is held steady, either active drug or placebo. At the end of the maintenance period, they can either taper off drug and exit the study, or there's an option to transition to open label treatment, which this is a currently ongoing study that is up to 100 weeks of open label treatment. Just coming back to this slide, the randomized trial was designed to include an initial enrollment of a small cohort, we call this the Sentinel cohort, and then pause enrollment for the rest of the study while we take a look at the data from the doses selected for the Sentinel cohort. And that's what we've done. All of the Sentinel cohort subjects have been enrolled. This is an ongoing development program in phase 2, as Fiona mentioned. So all of the Sentinel cohort subjects have been enrolled. They completed the double-blind study, and they've moved into the open label extension. And as I said, the open label extension is currently ongoing. We did decide, when looking at the Sentinel cohort data, to investigate additional doses than those which were selected originally. And so currently, the enrollment of the double-blind study is still paused while those doses are being investigated. And that's the status of our study. Whoops, there we go. So Neurocrine would very much like to extend our sincere thanks to the people in this room, the families who have contributed to the kayak studies, that's what we call them, and the entire SCN8A community for your attention and continued support. Thank you very much.
Thank you guys so much for that update. And gosh, I think I just need to just take a moment here to commend this group over here and how long Xenon and Neurocrine has been working with SCN8A. And we appreciate you guys so much. So thank you. All right, next. Yeah. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I forgot about questions. Yeah, jump in.
Okay, so one question from our virtual audience. If 352 is most effective in the inactivated state, will it only partially inhibit NAV 1.6 globally throughout the brain, which I assume has NAV 1.6 in all the different states at any given time?
That was a lot of words.
Can you repeat those words?
Do you want to read it? It might be easier.
Okay, so if 352 is most effective in the inactivated state, will it only partially inhibit NAV1.6 globally throughout the brain? Which, okay, so it's complicated.
The idea is that most of the time the channels are sitting in what's called the resting state, ready to be activated when neuronal membranes depolarize. So most of the time, the molecule should not be interacting with those channels. It's only when they've gone through an activation and inactivation to then go back into the resting state that that 352 is going to preferentially bind. So throughout the brain, there's going to be a gradient of binding, a gradient of inhibition, but there should be a preference for those hyperactivated neurons, which have more Nav1.6 in the inactivated state. I think that just about sums it up. And if anybody wants to add anything.
Awesome. Any other questions in the room?
I have a question about the 16-17 variant where the drug, and it's all, hearsay, right? But that's where the drug enters into the brain. I'm probably saying that incorrectly. So what we've learned is that you would need higher doses to get efficacy in a 16-17 patient. So would patients, children that have a 16-17 variant, even really be able to participate in the trial given the fact that their dose might need to be much higher than what your protocol dose would be that you selected for the, for the overall trial?
Would you mind now just the start of that question again? I didn't hear the first part. I didn't hear the first part of the question. I'll come over.
Yeah, I think it's, children that have go ahead. Sorry, Marianne, go ahead.
So what we've learned is that the 16-17 location, I'm not going to say the terms right, is where the drug enters into the brain.
The binding site, I think.
I'm not saying it right, but if that's, correct me if I'm wrong, because that would be a good thing too, but what we've heard is that you would need more drug to get efficacy if the variant is a 16-17 variant. So let's say you select a dose, and that dose is general across the study. I'm assuming that a 16-17 patient would not be able to be part of the study because they would require a higher dose. Otherwise, it would, would look non-efficacious.
We might answer this question in tandem. Okay, no, both Xenon and ourselves at Neurocrine are actually making sure that every patient that we enroll, after they've enrolled, not before, we don't have an inclusion or exclusion criteria around specific variants, but we're actually doing the work now, actually inspired by a lot of the work that Al George has done in the SCN8A and SCN8A world, where we're actually expressing each individual variant in cells and testing whether 352 can still block the activity of those variants. And so we're doing that work ongoing. But around inclusion, exclusion, I'll hand it over to Svetlana.
It's not an exclusion, right? So they would still be able to get in the trial and they would still have the same dose as the other participants. As Fiona said, we are double checking every variant after the fact as well, but at this moment there's no clinical data that indicates that it would work for one variant and not another.
And maybe
hearsay within the community. It's just like, it's not hearsay.
And so I'm going to be honest and say I don't recall exactly whether that variant is a gain of function or loss of function. Oh, binding site? Okay, so what we are doing is working with our, what's the name of that committee? We have a committee who checks each variant before, or each patient before they're enrolled, and we look at whether there is any reason that patient should not be enrolled. Right now, we have not come across one of those patients in the trial, but if one did present themselves, we would certainly review that and decide what makes sense. I don't think at the moment we have any evidence that that patient wouldn't respond. We also don't have any evidence that they would. So maybe just one other point. When Xenon did the studies, and I can't recall the data offhand. It's not that 352 didn't inhibit those channels at all. It's just you needed a little bit more concentration. Right.
Get one more virtual question here. We're getting mixed signals on the sodium channel blockers, carbamazepine, glucosamide, et cetera, efficacy on gain and loss of function variant. Are blockers only effective against one or both types?
So I'm going to point to Dr. Hammer over there, who is doing great work on this respect. I will say in general, and I'm not a physician, I don't treat patients, but I look at the data of all of our patients, and I've been in epilepsy research for a very long time. The general consensus is that sodium channel blockers are a rational treatment for gain of function. Loss of function is more of a question, and as you can see from the research presented tonight, they're generally not effective and less used because, whether that came about through research or just trial and error, they're generally less used for loss of function. But again, looking over there at Dr. Hammer's table, I think what we're finding is that it's not always so black and white. And so that has been the typical clinical treatment paradigm that the other physicians in this room can comment about more than me, but there's always exceptions, so.
Man, those are some tough questions. All right, you guys can sit down, relax, breathe. All right, so we're going to move on to the researcher panel. So I would now like to introduce Dr. Manoj Patel, Associate Professor in the Department of Anesthesiology at the University of Virginia. He will introduce each researcher in the Researcher Roundtable.
Thank you, Kacie, and it's lovely to see everybody again, and want to thank the organizers of the CUTE syndrome because it's really lovely that you set this event up for the researchers and the physicians and all the families to get together and learn a lot more. And I always learn a lot more coming to these things. I always go home with some really cool messages. So we're going to switch gears a little bit, and now we're going to talk about some of the basic science that's been done by some of the leading people in this field. And we're going to start off with Professor Al George, who I have followed for many, many years. He really is a key leader in the area of channelopathies and sodium channels. He's professor and chair at the Department of Pharmacology at Northwestern University. And Al's talk is Molecular and Cellular Context Influences, SCN8A Variant Function. Thank you, Al.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today, but more importantly, the opportunity to be inspired by parents and their families who are attending the meeting. Full disclosure, I don't have a PhD, which was on the last slide. I often thought about putting it on my slide just to see if anyone catches it, but it's not a good idea. Anyway, yes, today I'm going to give you some data that we've collected on experimental systems designed to determine the functional consequences of SCN8A variants, but I'm going to focus a little bit on some nuances of that work, which is we think it matters what the context of the SCN8A sodium channel that you're studying, whether that's the molecular composition of the sodium channel or in the cells that you study it. So why do we even bother determining the functional consequences of a genetic variant like in SCN8A? Well, we think across the board, among all genes, that it really helps to understand the molecular basis of the disease and what is the molecular mechanism of that disease. It also defines functional subsets, which may have relevance, as you've just heard, for determining optimal therapy. And we often use these terms gain of function and loss of function to broadly describe variants in SCN8A and other ion channels. But I'm here to tell you that it's probably more complicated than that. And at the end, hopefully you'll gain an appreciation that it's not so binary after all. There's also emerging opportunities to use functional information to better classify whether a genetic variant is pathogenic, in other words, disease-causing or not, So that's another reason to do it. And then, again, an extension of those other things is to help understand whether the mechanism is amenable to particular types of therapy. Now, the classic way of determining the functional consequence of a genetic variant in something like SCN8A, it uses what we call heterologous expression systems. Heterologous meaning we don't put it in a neuron where it normally lives, we put it in another type of cell which is more easily managed in the laboratory. And usually we put that in the sodium channel, like SCN8A, into a cell using what's called transfection. We place it in there artificially using a plasmid-based system. So we have a recombinant sodium channel, we have it sequenced, and we can make it into a form that allows us to enter it into the cells. And then those cells express it, and we can then use techniques such as patch clamp electrophysiology, which allows us to record the current, the electrical impulse from that individual cell, and deduce what the effect on the sodium current is. And so illustrated here are some representative sodium currents. Now, when we, as part of our Center Without Walls to study channelopathy-associated epilepsy, we had in our sites the opportunity to study genetic variants in many sodium channel genes and potassium channel genes. And one of the things that gave us a little bit of pause when we looked at how other groups were studying SCN8A variants was the common strategies used either the human SCN8A, which would be the one we think would be most relevant, or mouse or rat sequences, which we didn't think were the appropriate way. But more than that, it turns out that in the human brain, there are two predominant forms of the NaV1.6 sodium channel that comes from the SCN8A gene, one of which is expressed predominantly in the developing brain, and then it turns off and allows the more mature form of SCN8A to be expressed sometime during the first year of life. But it turned out that virtually every paper that was published in the last several years used the neonatal form of the channel. And we thought there was opportunities to maybe render opportunities to improve the study of these variants if we had both the neonatal form and what we call the adult form. The other thing was, what kind of cells should you use? One cell that was very popular, one cell type that was popularly used for this SCN8A field was called ND723 cells. These are neuronal derived cells, so they're almost like neurons. And the thought was that this is a more native environment than, say, a kidney cell or some other kind of weird cell. However, even though they do have neuronal properties, they have one problem, which is they already have a sodium current. So if you go to do that patch clamp experiment, you're going to see this gigantic current already without even adding SCN8A. So that confounds everything. So most groups have solved that problem by introducing another mutation that renders the channel sensitive to a neurotoxin called tetrodotoxin. It's the toxin that will kill you if you eat bad pufferfish. So the way around this is to make that mutation and then add tetrodotoxin to your experiment to kill off everything except the mutant that you've created in SCN8A. Well, the problem with that is now you're studying the effect of a mutation that may be in one of your children, but you've added the complicating factor of this other mutation. And we didn't like that idea. So kind of running through the splice variant, splice isoform, and this endogenous sodium current problem, we came up with some ideas. So first of all, what is these alternative forms that I'm talking about? Well, first of all, genes sometimes undergo what is called alternative splicing. When the gene is made, genes have parts that are called exons that are put together to make the protein coding part of the gene in the messenger RNA that the cell uses. Well, in sodium channels, and SCN8A is a good example, there are two copies of one of those exons. It's actually, we call it exon number 5, and one of those forms, which we call exon 5N, is there early in brain development. And then sometime after birth, during the first year of life, that goes away and the gene switches over to exon 5A. which we call the adult splice isoform. And people have looked at this in brain samples from humans across the lifespan, and as you see here, exon 5N in blue is the predominant form before birth. And then slowly over the first 6 to 12 months of life, it switches, and now you have the predominant red-colored exon 5A, or the adult form. So which one should we use? Well, I think for an early onset epilepsy, maybe the neonatal form is okay, but there's a mixture there in the brain, even at birth. So we're not sure. So we decided we should do them both. The other problem was, how do we get around, if we're using ND723 cells, which we chose to use, how do we get around this problem that they already have a sodium current? And we don't want to put in another mutation to complicate everything. So it turns out, we first figured out that that background sodium channel, it's not SCN8A, it's SCN9A, or NAV 1.7. It's a sodium channel that's in the peripheral nervous system. It's responsible for signals related to pain. And there's a huge amount of it there. The researchers in the room will recognize this is a Western blot. This little smudgy gray band is the sodium channel that we can detect with an antibody. And so how do we get rid of it? Well, we got rid of it by using CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing. We basically destroyed it. We corrupted the gene and eliminated it. So now we have a cell line, a unique cell line we call low NAV cells that have no background sodium channel. So now we don't have to put in the TTX thing. So we've adopted this approach. We use human SCN8A encoded NAV16, both adult and neonatal splice isoforms. We use the ND723 cells, but we modified them so they have no background sodium current. So when it comes time to, do we use the tetrodotoxin resistant version? We don't need to do that. It's off the table. So that's how we've that took a long time to sort all that out, but we did. And now we've also made one other adjustment, which is most labs, including ours, for years, we used what is called patch clamp recording, or manual patch clamp recording, which is a slow and tedious and labor-intensive process to get data on one variant, which could take you days or weeks to accomplish. And as you illustrate in this figure here, which I show to illustrate the complexity of the equipment and the technologists there, it's also to help me embarrass a former member of the lab, Lindsay Anderson, who's now part of Praxis and is part of the brilliant brain trust that Brian Pfister referenced earlier. We've shifted away from that slow, tedious manual method to using automated technology. And here is featuring this is our legacy automated patch clamp system that doesn't just allow us to record from one cell at a time, but rather 300 or so cells at a time. And so in the old days, it used to take days or weeks to, or days, many days to weeks to study one variant. Now we can study, 5 or 6 variants all at once and get it done. So we decided to really unleash this technology with these new technical improvements to start to study some selected SCN8A variants. First of all, let me illustrate for you why we bothered with all these splice isoform studies. First of all, we did not assume that they would behave the same, and in fact, they don't. They're functionally different. The differences are subtle, but they're real. And that we thought that was an important point, that we should be cognizant of the fact that variants may have different functional effects when they're in these two different splice isoform contexts. We then moved on to look at a small selection of genetic variants in SCN8A, all mostly reported before, and some of these were recurrent variants. You may recognize some of them on the list. Others were not recurrent or uncommon, and we chose a selection of variants that represented the diversity of phenotypes associated with that syndrome, with that gene. And here they're mapped on a little model of the channel. And then turning to the functional side, we didn't just measure 1 or 2 properties, we measured 10 properties of every single variant. And this is where it gets complicated, because you want to simply describe the channel as gain of function or loss of function. The question is, which of these properties do you look at? Do you pick out one, like persistent current? Oh, that's elevated, so that's a gain of function. Do you look at the current density? Well, that's lower than normal, so that's a loss of function. You can't cherry pick. You have to look at the whole picture. So, and there's also a lot of complexity here. We collected a lot of data. This is some of the classic ways of describing sodium channel function. We've invented some new ways of showing the data. This is a scatter plot just showing one property. This is the activation, voltage dependence of activation of the channel. And then finally, we've also resorted now to volcano plots to show that some of the variants have properties that shift to the left, loss of function, or to the right, gain of function. But now we're really looking at each individual property and asking the question, is the change in that property, is its difference compared to the normal channel compatible with gain of function or loss of function? And what we've seen, it's not a simple story. For some variants, it's a real mixture. We have some properties that are gain, some that are loss, all in the same variant. So what's the answer here? Well, we think that you can't answer that question simply with this one experiment. There has to be some way of assessing how does that variant impact neuronal firing in an actual neuron. So I'm here to just say that I think the gain of function versus loss of function paradigm is useful, but it's not as simple as we'd all love it to be, including myself. For every variant, there are differences between the adult splice isoform and the neonatal splice isoform, again, emphasizing that you can't just look at one or the other. And these are what we call radar plots, where each spoke of the radar diagram is a different variant, and then the three lines represent either the measurement from the normal sodium channel, which is the black circle as a reference, and then red and blue represent the adult and neonatal splice isoform expression of that variant. And you can see here they can be wildly different for some properties. I will also point out, as I mentioned before, we were really nervous about using any mutation to make the channel resistant to tetrodotoxin. And so here are the tetrodotoxin resistant variants. They have their own dysfunctional properties. So we thought, I'm glad we made these low NAV cells, because the TTX resistant channels are themselves abnormal. So to us, this is a cautionary tale. To other groups that want to use this technology, I think it's really important to recognize that when you introduce a second site mutation, it may give an altered result than what maybe nature intended. So I wish I had more time to explain a lot more in detail, but just to summarize, I think our major advance has been that we would think it's important to consider the splice isoform that may be relevant to each individual patient. In some cases, it's both. We've made this discovery of a way to make a neuronal neuronal cell line that doesn't have sodium current, which is a valuable resource, and we're happy to share it with anybody. We're staying away from making second site mutations that render the channel resistant to tetrodotoxin. Even though that's a useful tool, I think it's a dangerous tool, and we're staying away from it. And then lastly, illustrating that using automated patch clamp can really open up a high throughput lane on the highway to try to do functional studies of more and more variants. So I have a lot of people in my lab to thank. Carlos Venoye is the lead investigator on this project, but he was helped by many people in the lab. We also have the privilege of working with Ingo Helbig, and it's been an honor to work with Madeline and Chris as well on their special patient and their family. For those of you attending the AES meeting, we have a poster related to this topic. It's actually poster 3.511. That is the dead last poster in the poster session on Monday. Please come by and see us. It's probably in a bathroom somewhere, but anyway. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, questions? Eric.
This is a great talk, and I got to see it twice today. So Can you weigh in on, for physiologists and other researchers, your thoughts on how we should use language around gain of function and loss of function to tighten it up a bit, especially since, at least by my eyes, there are no pure gain of function or loss of function variants for anything you measured? Just thoughts you have.
Yeah, we're struggling with that. I think those terms are still useful, but I think there are a lot of caveats. And so I don't have a substitute. I think I would caution people from using gain and loss to describe the impact on neuronal firing. That's a mistake. I think you have to anticipate that there's going to be complex effects on neuronal firing, and that might be we're causing hyperexcitability or hypoexcitability, and that may be situation dependent. So I think the terms still have value for describing the molecular features, but I think one has to introduce the term mixed function into the mix. And we've done that successfully, I think, in SCN8A, SCN8A, work in progress.
Question back there.
Yeah, great talk. I also got to listen to it twice today. Phenomenal. I was wondering if with the high throughput analysis, if you had to do any sort of data correction to account for there being any sort of overlap between the wells or any issues with actually measuring individual instances, and if that can be contributing to any of the more confusing results, for lack of a better term.
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. First of all, I think there's advantages to automated patch clamp. One big one is we're blinded. The operator can't see the cell, can't pick the cell, can't introduce some unconscious bias when they're selecting a cell. And so I feel, and also we can record a lot more cells. Typical experiment, we're recording 25 to 50 cells. Manual patch clamp, very limited, maybe 10, 12, typically. So I think we have an advantage of more statistical power and blinding, less bias. In terms of correction, our goal is to create data filters that remove without individually looking at individual cells, but basically systematically removing any low quality recordings. And that means, in terms of electrophysiology, too high of an access resistance, low seal resistance, and some other properties. We have a list of about 8 or 9 variables that we check to make sure that the data quality are very high, and we throw out anything that is not meeting those criteria. That's before we analyze anything. We're still blinded at that point. So I think, in fact, it's a miracle my lab used to do manual patch clamp, knowing what we know now.
We have several virtual questions, if we can take those. Is that okay?
All right.
Could this be translated into a clinical pipeline to provide personalized medicine?
Can this be converted into a clinical pipeline to provide personalized medicine? I sort of interpret that as meaning we could study someone's unique genetic variant and maybe profile it against drugs to figure out which drug works best. Yeah, yes, conceptually, yes, that's possible.
Thank you. And from another attendee, earlier a talk suggested that human phenotype would characterize gain of function versus loss of function. Would the best prediction of impact be a combination of in vitro data with human phenotype?
So I think my understanding is the earlier talk by Joshua, they included a lot of data into their analysis, and that included, I believe, functional assessments of the variant. Wave your hand if that's not right.
Only final decisions on if it's gain or loss of function, no electrophysiological components for modeling.
I see. So the modeling, you incorporated just the binary classifier and not detailed functional data, right? Yes, right. And we've talked earlier today that perhaps we should share some more granular data with you to see if that illuminates anything, which we will do.
Yeah, I had a quick question, and I don't think there's an answer for this. I agree with you that neuronal excitability is the way we're going to say that was really a gain of function and that was a loss of function. How do we do that, though? Because if we get these isolated neurons, they're firing action potentials, and I don't think we'd be able to get action potentials by expressing enough of the mutant.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. I don't think anyone's really come up with the best solution. I think certainly some people might argue we should make a transgenic mouse on every variant. Not possible. There's not enough money at NIH to support that. iPS cell technology is emerging as another strategy, but it's also very limited in throughput. Currently, if you ask me, I mean, we're enamored with this idea of using what's called dynamic clamp, where you can have a neuron model running in the background, and then you feed into it the recordings that you made with patch clamp to see how they influence the firing of a theoretical neuron. And that's very high throughput, potentially. And so that's where we're kind of leaning right now, but it's not perfect.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. Thank you. Okay, as we continue, our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Wong. I think many of you know Jennifer. Jennifer has been at the University of Emory for some time as a postdoc with Andrew in Andrew's lab, and now is an assistant professor. And her title of her talk is Repurposing... No, it's the wrong one, sorry. Approaches for treatment development of SCN8A derived epilepsy. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Minaj, for the introduction, and for everyone in the TCSF for the invitation to present some of our work today. So as Minaj said, my work today, or the talk today, is going to focus on treatment development in SCN8A epilepsy. And let's see if I know how to work this thing. Awesome. Okay, so first I wanted to share with you all, I'm not sure if everyone knows, but we have a lot of different SCN8A mouse models in the ASCAI laboratory. And I just want to point out to everyone some of the mice that we have. Most of them are published, but we also have, if this works, the pointer, a conditional knock-in of the R850Q mouse that we're currently characterizing. And we also have some other mice with in-frame deletions and insertions that we've previously published by George Inglis in the lab. And then we have some mice with mutations in the D4S4 that we've heard about already with R1620L mutation, and 2 mice with in-frame deletions as well. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on these mice. So we were interested in the R1620L mutation because the patient presented with milder epilepsy and a number of behavioral deficits. And so we had generated this mouse, and then we've characterized it, and we found that, that this mouse is useful for studying SCN8A in epilepsy and autism. So in our previous characterization, we found that these mice have spontaneous seizures, they have increased susceptibility to induced seizures, they have a number of behavioral abnormalities. So they are hyperactive, they have social deficits, learning and memory deficits, and these mice have mixed effects on the channel. So they have reduced action potential thresholds and action potential firing frequency. Now, in the process of making the R1620L mouse, we also generated 2 additional mice, which we call VIR and IRL. So these mice have in-frame deletions that span this positively charged arginine residue. And interestingly, when we looked at susceptibility to the proconvulsant fluorothil, we found that all 3 of the mutants had much shorter latencies to the first generalized tonic-clonic seizure, indicating that these mice are also seizure susceptible. So for all the data I'm going to show you today with our treatment development, we use the R1620L or RL mutants. And so we've taken a number of different strategies for treatment development in the lab. And so the first one, we're interested in repurposing drugs, so using drugs that are used in other diseases and disorders and to test them in our mice. So I'll tell you some of our work with amitriptyline and carvedilol. And we're also interested in identifying novel therapeutic targets. So we've been interested in the endocannabinoid system. And last year we published showing that cannabidiol, or CBD, was able to increase seizure resistance in our SCN8A RL mutants. And then lastly, we're also interested in novel delivery methods. And so I'll share some of our work today on nanoparticle encapsulation of neuropeptides. And so this paper was published a few years ago. It was an in vitro drug screen that had looked to try to find drugs that might be efficacious in SCN8A-derived epilepsy. And so essentially this paper had looked at looking at sodium current influx, and they screened thousands of drugs to see which drugs might block the sodium current influx. And so the top 3 drugs that came from this screen was carvedilol, novatapine, and amitriptyline. And so being a mouse laboratory, we wanted to test whether these drugs would also work in our mouse models. And so we first tested these drugs in wild-type mice using a 6 hertz seizure induction paradigm. So in this paradigm, mice receive an electrical stimulus, and then we score the behavioral seizure response. So here you can see, so a score of 0 means the mouse is completely normal, and then increasing in severity to a 3, where the mouse exhibits a generalized tonic-clonic seizure. And so the first drug we tested was novatapine. And so you can see here that mice that received vehicle, so the solution where we make the drug up, had a class 2 seizure. And then you can see that mice that received the other doses of novatapine also had a class 2 seizure. And due to solubility of this drug, we weren't able to test this drug any further. So when we looked at amitriptyline, we did a dose response curve, and we found that a dose of 30 mg per kg amitriptyline was able to increase resistance to 6 hertz seizures in the wild-type mice. We also found that this dose of amitriptyline was able to protect against pentylene tetrazole-induced seizures, or PTZ-induced seizures in the mice. However, when we went into our SCN8A RL mutants, we found that amitriptyline was not able to increase seizure resistance. So when we tested carvedilol, we also found that a dose of 20 mg per kg of carvedilol was able to increase resistance in the wild-type mice, and also against PTZ-induced seizures in the wild-type mice. And unlike the other drugs, we did find that carvedilol was able to increase seizure resistance in the RL mutants. So we tested using the same 6 hertz seizure induction paradigm. So you can see that the RL mutants that received vehicle all had a class 2 seizure, and that most of the mice treated with carvedilol, we were able to increase resistance to 6 hertz seizures. We also looked at susceptibility to PTZ-induced seizures with the RL mutants and carvedilol treatment. So you can see here in the black lines, these are the RL mutants given vehicle, and you can see this rightward shift in mutants that received carvedilol, indicating that we were able to increase seizure resistance with carvedilol treatment in the RL mutants. And interestingly, the wild-type mice that received carvedilol did not seize at all during this period. And so we're doing ongoing studies now to look at carvedilol in other aspects of behavior, and then also looking to see whether carvedilol will also block spontaneous seizures. So in addition to these drugs, we were also interested to study fenfluramine. So fenfluramine has received a lot of interest recently for severe pediatric epilepsy. And we also wanted to see whether fenfluramine might be efficacious in SCN8A-derived epilepsy. And so this was a recent case report that came out that had looked at the effect of fenfluramine in 3 patients with SCN8A epilepsy. And as you can see here, these are the mutations that these patients had. And these patients also had a number of different seizure types, neurodevelopmental delay. And what they found in this case report was that fenfluramine was able to significantly reduce seizure frequency in these patients. And so again, we wanted to test whether fenfluramine would be efficacious in our mice. So we first looked at fenfluramine in wild-type mice and generated a dose-response curve, and we found that there were 2 doses that were able to modestly protect against 6 hertz seizures in the wild-type mice. However, when we went to our RL mutants, we found that vehicle-treated and fenfluramine-treated mutants had the same seizure response, indicating that we weren't able to increase seizure resistance with fenfluramine treatment. But there are several caveats. It is possible that, so we also have seen this same response in SCN8A mice, but patients with Dravet syndrome, fenfluramine works really well for them. And so it is possible that, in our mice, maybe we have to give fenfluramine chronically. We also have not looked at fenfluramine on spontaneous seizures and behavior, so those are other things that we also need to look into. And so we're also interested in studying neuropeptides as a potential treatment for epilepsy. And there are many reasons. The first one being that there are many limitations to conventional anti-seizure drugs. The side effects, severe sedation, behavioral effects. We're also interested in neuropeptides because they're often co-released with other neurotransmitters, and so they can modulate both excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmitters. And neuropeptides their receptors are often widely distributed through the brain, so they can have a broad effect as well. But there are several challenges to studying neuropeptides in the brain. The first one being that neuropeptides have poor blood-brain barrier penetrance, so they can't easily enter from the blood and enter into the brain. And if they do, neuropeptides are often rapidly degraded and metabolized, so they have very short half-lives. And so the first neuropeptide that we were interested in is oxytocin, and there are numerous reasons. So oxytocin is synthesized in the hypothalamus, and it has receptors throughout the brain. Oxytocin has many effects, including that it can promote prosocial behavior, maternal behavior, it's neuroprotective, it can increase neuronal inhibition, it has anti-inflammatory properties. Now, at the time that we had started studying oxytocin, there were only 3 papers that had looked at the effect of oxytocin in epilepsy, and this could be due to the challenges for studying neuropeptides in the brain. And so to overcome these challenges, we, in collaboration with Martin D'Souza and Kevin Murnane, developed a bovine serum albumin nanoparticle preparation to encapsulate neuropeptides. And so I'll refer to this as NPOT. And so we had previously tested the effect of NPOT in an SCN8A mouse model of epilepsy. And so we had found here, so this is using our SCN8A mouse model of GES+. And so we gave mice either empty or unfilled nanoparticles, free or unencapsulated oxytocin, and our nanoparticle encapsulated oxytocin, or NPOT. So you can see that the SCN8A mutants that received empty nanoparticles all had a class 2 seizure, and 2 of the SCN8A mutants that had free or unencapsulated oxytocin were protected against 6 Hz seizures. But you can see that most of the NPOT-treated SCN8A mutants were protected against 6 Hz seizures. And so this was tested at 20 minutes after intranasal administration. And so I retested the same mice 6 hours later. And so now you can see that all of the SCN8A mutants that had free unencapsulated oxytocin had a class 2 or 3 seizure, and most of the NPOT-treated SCN8A mutants were still protected against 6 Hz seizures. So this shows that we were able to use our nanoparticle encapsulation to improve blood-brain barrier penetrance and obtain sustained seizure protection. We also found that our NPOT preparation was able to restore more normal social behavior in the SCN8A mutants. And so we also wanted to test whether our NPOT preparation would be beneficial in our SCN8A RL mutants. And so using the 6 Hz paradigm, so we found that, as you can see here, the mice RL mutants that had empty nanoparticles all had a class 2 seizure, and most of the NPOT RL mutants were protected against 6 Hz seizures. And we also looked at susceptibility to the proconvulsant pentylene tetrazole, and we found, so here in the black squares, you can see the RL mutants that had received empty nanoparticles, and you can see this rightward shift in the curve following NPOT treatment, indicating that these are the RL mutants that had an increased latency to the first GTCS, and about half of the mice were also protected against having a seizure during this period. And so we're actively looking at the effect of NPOT also on spontaneous seizures and behavior, and we're exploring other neuropeptides as well. So the last thing I want to leave you with is that an interesting finding that I came across while looking at the effect of drugs on seizures and behavior. And so one of the things that I've been interested in is looking at, especially interested, is looking at the behavioral phenotypes in our mice. So these are the RL mutants. And so what I have here is looking at locomotor behavior using the open field paradigm. And so these were RL mutants that are 4 months of age, so adult mice. And so what we can see here is that the RL mutants traveled a lot farther, and they're also a lot faster than the wild type mice, indicating that they're hyperactive. And on the bottom, you can see I looked at the latency to fall off an accelerating rotorod as a measure of motor function. You see no difference between the mutants and wild type. And so indicating that the mutants have normal motor function. But when I looked at 8 months of age, I found that the mutants are still hyperactive, but now you can see that the RL mutants fall off the rotorod much faster compared to wild-type mice, indicating that the mutants have this motor impairment. And when I tested the mice at 16 months of age, I also see the same response in that the mutants are hyperactive and that they have this motor impairment. And so this is an important consideration when we're thinking about drug testing. So we can see here that the phenotype of the mice does evolve with age. And I think it's an important consideration to take that when we're drug testing is to test these drugs at different ages as well. And so in summary, I've shown you today that in the ASCII laboratory, we have many different SCN8A mouse models that we're also really happy to share with anyone that's interested. I've also shown you our different approaches for looking for drug testing in SCN8A epilepsy. And I've shown you that carvedilol and MPOT were able to increase resistance in our SCN8A RL mutants. And I just wanted to leave you with the thought that when we're thinking about drug testing, we should look at multiple phenotypes in our mice and patients, and at different ages as well. And so I'd like to first thank my mentor, Andrew ASCII, and then all of our collaborators and our funding and everyone here for their attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Going back to the previous whole debate, the 16 is RL plus, sorry. For virtual attendees. I'm so sorry. Virtual folks. Are we thinking about this as a gain or loss or something in the middle?
I would say it's a combination. They have both gain and loss of function effects on the channel. The mice, if you're thinking, I mean, they have a severe seizure phenotype, but not as severe as some of the other, like A50Q.
Yeah, I mean, it's a class 2 Ricine, more like it's a head nodding or a myoclonic or what?
I mean, that's different from a spontaneous seizure. So these are induced seizures. So what we call class 2 is head bobbing, rearing, paw waving. A 3 is more of a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, but this is very different from their spontaneous seizure phenotype.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks.
Hey, Fiona Scott from Neurocrine. Hi. Okay, this is really cool that you've got this really interesting phenotype quite late in the animal's development. So if you were to sort of think about how you would start to prioritize the kind of drug classes you'd want to test to see if you can improve that motor function, what would you do?
Well, right now we're trying to just characterize the motor function more. So that was just looking at one aspect of motor function, like gross motor function. So I think it'd also be important to look at fine motor function. And then we're also looking at just other behavioral phenotypes as well. So it could be that other changes emerge as well. But as far as the drugs, I'm not sure.
We have a couple virtual questions. If oxytocin increases protection from seizures, are women more protected due to generally higher oxytocin levels?
Could you repeat the question, Sarah?
Sure. If oxytocin increases protection from seizures, are women more protected due to generally higher oxytocin levels?
That's a good question. So we only tested the male mice. So, I mean, I think it's also an important consideration to test female mice when we're looking at drugs as well, but we haven't done that yet.
Thank you. And what mechanism are you proposing for the positive effect of carvedilol? I don't know if I pronounced that correctly.
Oh, carvedilol is a beta blocker. So probably mechanisms on the noradrenergic system. So Minaj and they have also published, and Eric, looking at effects of the noradrenergic system in SCN8A epilepsy.
Thank you.
Much. Thank you. So our next speaker needs no introduction whatsoever. He is the professor at the University of Arizona, and he has spent quite a few years working on SCN8A and has really is a key leader. So this is Mike Orhammer.
How to get this thing to work? Anybody know?
Use the other one.
I want the pointer. Okay. All right. Well, hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. And I'm going to talk about, I think Jennifer's talk's a great segue to what I want to talk about. I want to stretch us a little bit more out of the box of looking at the channel and looking at the downstream effects of the hyperexcitability caused by mutations affecting NaV1.6. So this slide is I'm introducing the players here in my talk. This is called the neurovascular unit. And you have a capillary going through the brain, and you have an astrocyte with end feet on the capillary, and then you have neurons, and then NaV1.6 is going to sit on those excitatory and inhibitory neurons. And the blood-brain barrier is essentially the block between the blood flowing in the capillary, which is coming from your entire body, going into the brain, and then it's only going to allow certain things in. That's because the brain's an immunologically privileged organ. You can't just put anything in the brain. You have to be very careful about what gets in the brain. So those are the players in the talk. Now let's see if I can figure out how to advance it. There we go. So I am going to stretch this a little bit out of the box, but Jennifer already has done that. So basically all very familiar with the long process of de novo drug discovery, the long and expensive process, and how many years it takes and the difficulty, but we have these heroes working on our behalf to develop these smart drugs that are going to do better than our conventional drugs. But then over here is the drug repurposing. It's a way of skipping some of the steps because you take drugs that are already approved by the FDA, for example, in the US. So I want to talk about a repurposed drug that I am working on. And the advantage is you have known safety profiles. In this particular case, the drug is approved to 1-year-olds, so it's very safe. It's for a different indication, and I'm not going to tell you the name of the drug yet because I'm still working on publishing it, but it's a drug that's indicated for hypertension, not for seizures, so it's being repurposed. And the time and cost savings is already obvious, and then the nice thing that Jennifer pointed out, it's good for trying to find novel targets. So this is just summarizing NaV1.6, its expression on the axon and the nodes around NVA and the axon initial segment. It's a master regulator of neuronal excitability. And most of the drugs that we're familiar with are either targeting NaV1.6 or sodium channels in general. The smart drugs are going to go specifically after NaV1.6 or the persistent current that it creates. Or they're drugs that, like the GABAergic drugs that work on neurotransmitter receptors, the GABAergic neurons, and things like that. That's all basically in a sort of a limited class of drugs with respect to what I'm going to be talking about. This is sort of the model that I'm calling the downstream injury cascade. So when you have seizures, sorry, how do I go back here? Here's NaV1.6, and so what I'm going to be talking about here in the presynaptic neuron, you have NaV1.6, you have the synapse, and then the postsynaptic neuron, and then the neurotransmitter is released, glutamate for the excitatory neurons. And so when you have, let's say, a malfunctioning NaV1.6, it's overexpressing, it's too many action potentials, it releases too much glutamate. We have something called glutamate toxicity. Glutamate toxicity is common to many disorders, it's not just to seizures, and that leads to the postsynaptic receptors, the NMDA receptor, allowing too much calcium in. You get this calcium influx. You have oxidative stress at the mitochondrial level because of this calcium influx and this calcium signaling. The cell is going to respond by changing the ways genes are transcribed, and then they're going to produce products like cytokines and inflammatory products. And that leads to downstream damage leading to gliosis, fibrosis, and blood-brain barrier dysfunction. So when you have seizures or you have a hyperexcitable state, what's downstream of NaV1.6 is significant, and there are many, many players. These all are part of many neurological disorders, and so if we could solve some of the problems that other people are working on these other neurological disorders, we may be able to work our way back to understanding something about SCN8A. And in fact, there may be some combination of treatments that would be treating the downstream effects as well as the upstream effects. So I just want to bring that together. It's a model. I've put it together by connecting dots in the literature from what we know and what we can measure, and some of these things are inferred to take place. I'm going to show you some examples where I really think a key aspect of this is the blood-brain barrier dysfunction. Okay, so now I need to tell you about the model that I'm working on. So these are SCN8, these are 1768D mice that we started out on a C57 black 6 background. I've transferred it to the C3H HEJ background, and I'm working with juvenile mice that are homozygous on the black 6 background. I'm working with homozygous mice on the C3H background that are young adults, and I'm working with heterozygous mice on the black 6 background, and you can see here the survival, percent surviving over time if you leave the mice alone. And so each of these is a decay of 100% survival to 100%. You see it's 100% lethal. Now, I don't want people to be freaked out when we talk about lethality in these mice. I heard Jennifer Carney today say something that was really interesting. She said the mice have little brains and the excitability takes them all the way to death, whereas in humans, it would probably take you to status. And I think that's kind of an interesting way, in a thumbnail way of looking at it, that you shouldn't think of these mice, because they go to death as our outcome, that that's something we can say that's likely for humans. So anyway, this is the model, and so you can see that something about the statistics here about the seizure onset, the lifetime, how long they live, how many seizures they have. I've watched these mice for their entire lifetime, and I've counted these seizures manually. That means I watch a computer and I count the number of seizures they have, and I count the number of days they live. And I've done it for 4 years straight, 365 days a year. I've probably watched 330,000 seizures. So if I wasn't crazy beforehand, I'm crazier now. I don't think anyone else would do that. That's called passion. But anyway, I don't think there's, in order for me to actually get the data, I have to have several mice under camera in each container. And so there's no AI that can do this. The human brain is amazing what it can do. So I think I have a probably 95% accuracy. So the next thing is, what was the purpose of this talk and the work that we're doing? Well, I wanted to investigate the effects. I had a revelation one day, and I said, I want to try this drug. There was no prelude to that other than I knew a little bit about it, and I knew it worked in hypertension, but I also knew it worked in migraine. So I thought, frankly, I'm on the drug. Okay, there's a full disclosure right there. It's safe. It makes you crazy, but anyway. So I wanted to compare survival and seizure frequency in the mice that were treated, and I was going to test for a blood-brain barrier dysfunction and gene expression. So I was going to take the hippocampus of the mice at various stages, because I know exactly when they're going to have their seizure and how many they've had, and I can sample the mice at various places along the way. And so I can then take samples of the hippocampus and do whole genome RNA sequencing. I can look at 23,000 genes and see how they're differentially expressed at each stage on the build-up to seizures, after seizures, what happens to the brain. And then I wanted to see the effect of treating the animals and not treating the animals. Okay, so these are the juvenile mice. The importance of having these different models is the juvenile brain and the adult brain are different. The juvenile brain, which is most of we think of when we think of our kids, the brain is more excitable than an adult brain. So you have to be able to test the drug in both the adult state and the juvenile state. And so this is an example of testing the drug. This is, again, the survival curve. Here's if you don't treat the mouse, and here's if you do treat the mouse. So it extends the survival of these mice significantly. Here's a p-value of 10 to the minus fifth with an effect size that's large. Here is the seizure reduction on the treated mice. And I use phenytoin as a control. So down here, I'm treating the mice with phenytoin, and you can see that it barely extends their lifespan from untreated mice, but it does a really good job of reducing seizures. So seizures are reduced by phenytoin, but survival is not statistically significantly improved. If we look at the adult mice, we have also the same result. So these are the treated adult mice. You get a very strong effect size of treating with the drug. It increases survival. It reduces seizures, not tremendously so, but to some degree. And here is on the other background of the other young adults on the C3H background, similar effect. So I've tested females, I've tested males. It works for both. I've tested young, I've tested adult. It works for both, and it works on different strains. So it's very robust. And I worried that if I just did it on a B6 background, a black 6 background, I could be getting some unusual effects. So I've kind of worked around that. Okay, here's the really cool result. So this is an experiment where we infuse C14 sucrose into the brain of the animal. I can do it after I know exactly how many seizures it's had and when the last seizure was. And you can see here's a wild type mouse. The further up this axis, the more brain permeability. And you can see here is a pre-seizure male that is untreated. So you can see the blood-brain barrier is already disrupted before seizures start. This is day 42, 6 weeks. They're not going to have the first seizure for another 30 days. So the blood-brain barrier in the SCN8A mouse model is already permeable before seizures start. So seizures aren't the first outcome measure of epilepsy. There's something else going on that leads to your first seizure. It's a tipping point. And then you have the mice that have had 20 seizures. I knew exactly how many they have. I took them at 20 seizures, and you can see the blood-brain barrier is even more permeable. If you treat with the drug, you can see you can bring it back to wild type. In both cases, it's close. It's not quite as far down as it is in the pre-TC, but the post-TC. And I say TC, I forgot to tell you that these are tonic-clonic seizures these mice have. They're fully tonic-clonic, and so they're very violent seizures, as you all know. Now, this is a little bit more difficult to understand, but what I've done here is I've taken the untreated mice are shown in these bars here, and these are signaling pathways that I can measure through my gene expression studies. These are pathways that are related to oxidative stress, inflammation, blood-brain barrier dysfunction. This TGF-beta signaling is very important for blood-brain barrier functionality, and fibrosis or gliosis, like the pulmonary fibrosis idiopathic signaling is essentially a fibrotic or gliotic signaling pathway. And you can see this is a Z-score. It tells you that these pathways are highly activated in the post-seizure mice, and these are deactivated. And when you treat with the drug, it brings it back down to baseline for all of these pathways. It's probably overcalling the number of pathways because they share a lot of related genes, but the fact is the drug cleaned up the transcriptome amazingly so. So it's done a great job with the blood-brain barrier. It's done an interesting job with the signaling pathways as well. So this is my model now. So we've got this series of processes from a persistent current at NaV 1.6, glutamate toxicity, leading to oxidative stress, inflammation, fibrosis, gliosis, blood-brain barrier. Eventually there's a tipping point leading to the seizure onset, and comorbidities, I believe, are coming out of these kinds of blood-brain barrier dysfunction processes. And what the drug is doing is blocking two sides of this pathway. It's an agonist that I think is helping oxidative stress, and it's a blocker that is reducing inflammation and blood-brain barrier. So the next step is the conclusion, the drug improves outcomes. I'm not going to say it cures seizures, because that's way off. It's improving quality of life, if you might think of it that way. And it's doing so across ages, across sexes, and across genetic backgrounds. The next step is to do a better job of pinpointing which targets are actually being affected. And I have a student now doing Western blots, looking at the blood-brain barrier proteins and things like that. If we can nail that down, Colin is doing that kind of work right now. And then we wanted to find the dynamics of the blood-brain barrier opening and closing. We don't know if it's opening and then healing quickly, or if it's, we understand the dynamic better. Because the mice, just like humans, they have seizure bouts, then they have natural gaps, then they have bouts, and they have natural gaps. And so we'd like to understand what is causing those gaps. And I think it might have something to do with the blood-brain barrier healing. And then I would like to do a trial in the mice where we combine the drug with a sodium channel blocker to see if we can even do better. And then ultimately, since it's already FDA approved, my next step would try it in children. And I really welcome feedback from all the people that do that for a living. That's new to me, and I'd love some advice and to see if this is even worth pursuing. But love to get your feedback on that. That's it. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions.
Hello, Dr. Hammer. Great talk. Thank you very much. I just had a question on a statement you made earlier. You said that seizures aren't the first outcome of SCN8A epilepsy. And I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on, we had a talk obviously before about age-based SCN8A splice variants. And I was wondering, do you possibly think that that statement that you made could be an influence of how these splice variants are causing different comorbidities or phenotypes other than seizures in SCN8A?
Yeah, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I would think that, and I think Manoj has also shown this, that there are all kinds of things that are happening before seizures start that probably have nothing to do with the isoform that's being expressed. I mean, I think we don't know in the mouse exactly when the neonatal and the adult switchover takes place with the age of the mouse, but I would best, it's more related to the fact that there's a drip, drip, drip at the NAV 1.6. It's dripping, 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 and it's causing that whole downstream cascade to occur. And at physiological conditions, the brain is able to cope with that. But at some point, it's not able to cope with it. And so then you go into a pathological condition where then there's a tipping point. And normally we think of this in terms of an inhibition-excitatory balance that gets out of whack. I would put it more in my model, it's more of a redox balance. So there's oxidation and antioxidation. And we produce antioxidants in our brain, and we also, the whole process of producing ATP produces a tremendous amount of oxidants. Those damage the cells, and the brain can deal with that up into a point, and then that's what I mean by the tipping point. So the seizure, it's just like if you have a heart attack, you didn't just get heart disease today. You've had a long period of developing that disease before you get your heart attack. The same with Alzheimer's, the same with all disease. I would argue that it's general, and that we shouldn't think of epilepsy as your first seizure. We should think of it, the first seizure is telling you, you've had epilepsy for a while. That's just my point of view, but it's a model.
So again, great talk. I'm always impressed how you can go between different disciplines to study SCN8A from different avenues. One observation, we know babies have a leakier blood-brain barrier anyway. If you look at some of their CSF values, right, they have different norms than older people do. I imagine mice have the same thing. Did you look at that at all in this model? And then the corollary there, I guess, is, do you think that, we always kind of think it's the specific variants that result in a more severe phenotype, but maybe somehow it's also if certain variants cause earlier seizure onset in this, leaky blood-brain barrier setting, might that be setting them up for a worse disease course in the long run?
The second part? The first part, I would say, I would love to do that experiment, but my colleague, Patrick Ronaldson, was too clumsy to get it into a juvenile mouse. So we have now cameras and microscopes, so we could probably do that. I think that'll be one of our next steps as well. But he's putting a cannula in the carotid artery of the animal when it was on a table and injecting the dye that way. But now we can do it better. Maybe we'll get to the fact that we can do a little tiny guy. But go ahead, what was the second part?
We have a very good interventional neuroradiologist. It sounds like I can't even imagine doing something that precise. So the other question was, do you think that in part the reason why some of the kids who have very early seizure onset maybe is, we always have the mutation, maybe it's this in some way, can you do a conditional, knock in for the 850 and, does that change, a later onset of seizures, would that somehow influence?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, the fact that babies have more, maybe is that tied to what I was saying about babies having more excitable brains? Because the brain is developing and there's so much neurodevelopment happening, it's hyperexcitable. But I think in the context of SCN8A, why do some kids, why are they born with seizures and why do some take it 10 months to have their first seizure? That tipping point being different? Fascinating. I don't know.
Two virtual questions, Dr.
Okay.
Hammer. The first is, how many other known BBB permeability diseases present seizures?
Oh, well, you're at risk for seizures with Alzheimer's. You're at risk for seizures for, TBI. TBI is a classic example, clunk on the head, and then weeks to months later you can have your first seizure. The same players are involved with TBI. I'm not sure about some of the other, ALS, Parkinson's, Huntington's. I'm not sure about seizure risk for those, but
Thank you. And secondly, in your survival studies, what typically kills the mice, and does this change based on the treatment?
They die in, most of the mice die in status. And if you watch what happens over the course of the lifetime, they can recover from seizures very well early on. But after 80 or 90 seizures over a course of several weeks, their sleep is so disrupted, they can't settle down anymore. And I think it's a combination of a sleep deficit and they go into status very easily. And once they're in status, the mechanism of death is, well, their last seizure is always a tonic seizure, so I think it is respiratory related. But Manoj probably knows more than I do about that. It's not SUDEP, what I'm talking about. It's like they're in status. They're having seizure after seizure, they can't recover, and then they die. But the last seizure is always a tonic. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think during status you get a lull and neuronal damage and everything else, right? They're just not recovering, so.
Yeah, maybe there's no ATP left for anything else you're using. Having a seizure is an energy consumptive process, tremendously. And so that's why your mitochondria have to be functioning well to replace what I'm making some of this up. It's a model, but I think it makes sense based on what we know about mitochondrial function, oxidative stress, the amount of ATP it takes to have a seizure and to recover. You have to put all those ions back on the right sides of the bilipid membrane, and that takes a lot of energy.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Michael. That was wonderful. Thank you. Okay, our final speaker today is Dr. Jacy Wagnon, who had trained with Miriam Meisler. She's currently an assistant professor in the Department of Neuroscience at Ohio State. Unfortunately, she couldn't be here today, so she has pre-recorded her presentation.
Next year, I'll be able to be there with you in person. I'm excited to tell you today about my work with a novel mouse model of SCN8A encephalopathy and what we're learning about motor impairment using this new model. So I've been working with mouse models of SCN8A now for quite a long time, and the two that I've been involved with studying have been our constitutive knock-in in 1768D and our conditional knock-in R1872W. Both of these variants of SCN8A are gain of function, primarily with impairments in inactivation of the sodium channel. Now, we've learned a lot from these two mouse models. We've first of all, been able to recapitulate the seizures and the premature lethality that are characteristic in SCN8A epilepsy. And we've also been able to learn about how different cell types are affected by the SCN8A mutation. For example, we know that there's neuronal hyperexcitability in cortex, in hippocampus, and even in some inhibitory neurons in these models. We know that there's some hyperexcitability of cardiac myocytes, and we've been able to show that there are apneas that occur during the seizures, and both of these might be related to sudden unexpected death in epilepsy in this population. And finally, with our conditional model, we were able to show that excitatory neurons specifically are important for generation of the seizures in these models. So when the conditional allele is expressed only in excitatory neurons, for example, using an EMX1 Cree, then that's sufficient to generate seizures in those mice. However, when we look at what else is happening in individuals with SCN8A epilepsy, we see that neuromuscular and motor abnormalities are among the most common comorbidities. So these are things like severe hypotonia, different movement disorders, low muscle tone, and these comorbidities have not been very well modeled in those original mouse models. Those mouse models have normal motor control, normal movement, normal muscle tone, etc. So in my lab at Ohio State University, I have developed a new mouse model. Again, this is a missense mutation. Here it's the threonine 767 to isoleucine. It's located in domain 2, segment 1. So it's much further upstream than our previous two alleles we had modeled in mouse. I know some of you guys may also be making new mouse models, and those will be really interesting as well. What we chose to do was to pick one that had a distinct molecular mechanism. In this case, primarily with T767I, we see a premature activation So we see a hyperpolarizing shift in the voltage dependence of activation. These channels are open to early. However, they do undergo normal steady state inactivation, unlike the other two alleles modeled in mouse. These were also present in the last exon, whereas T767I is upstream, and so we had to do a different strategy for generating this allele. I will say that the clinical description for at least 5 individuals with this mutation show that it's recurrent, and they had very early onset myoclonic jerks and stiffness. So neonatally, they had very early onset seizures at 2 weeks, and so showed some delayed myelination on an MRI. They also had profound central hypotonia and spasticity. So we thought that this mouse, in addition to modeling a different molecular mechanism, may help us study some of those motor comorbidities that we couldn't get at with previous mice. The way that we constructed this allele was to put a flock stop upstream of exon 14. And so this is just an SV40 flock stop construct. And we also, at the same time, in cis, put in our missense mutation. So what happens is, in a wild-type mouse, of course, they have 100% wild-type SCN8A messenger RNA. In our carrier mice, what we call conditional, these guys are actually heterozygous null because they have that flock stop in one allele. So they have 50% total SCN8A mRNA, and it's all wild type. However, when there is exposure to Cre recombinase, then that flock stop is going to be removed and the mutated allele will be expressed. So we chose to do a ubiquitous expression with SOX2 Cre, and in this case, all of the neurons will have 50% wild-type SCN8A mRNA, and then 50% of our mutant T767I mRNA. So they'll be fully heterozygous, just like a germline heterozygote. And we also were able to determine by isolating brain messenger RNA, total RNA from the brain, that we did in fact see, compared to our wild type, this 50% reduction in our conditional mouse. And then once that exposure to Cre occurred, we got that bump back up to full wild type levels because of that T767I expression coming online. And we were able to demonstrate that our new mice, heterozygous T767I mice, do have seizures and premature lethality. So just like the other SCN8A models, they have that validity where they're modeling these phenotypes. We see tonic seizures. These are very early onset, starting as early as P14 or P15. And we see reduced survival of 100% of the mice, so 100% penetrance, starting again within a couple days of seizure onset, so somewhere between P16 and usually prior to weaning P21. Now, in the previous conditional mouse that I worked with, the R1872W, again, we had used EMX1 Cre to express the mutation selectively in excitatory neurons and showed that that also recapitulated seizures and sudden death. And we also did that with this mouse and again saw that we see seizures with EMX1 dependent expression of T767I and also premature lethality. They do have a slight extension, just like we saw in the 1872 mice, but they all do 100% develop seizures and have that premature lethality as well. So we're very confident that our mouse is modeling SCN8A epilepsy. We also took the step to collaborate with the Wester Lab here at Ohio State to look at neuronal hyperexcitability and saw that in the T767I and CA1 region of hippocampus, we do see hyperexcitability of the neurons. They fire more, and when they do fire these action potentials, they have these multiplets that show up, and we see a lot of ectopic bursting also in these neurons. Again, this is very similar to what has been demonstrated in the previous mouse models of SCN8A epilepsy. So I have a very talented PhD student in the lab. He is in his 4th year now, Midhun Ane, and he has really been driving the characterization of this new mouse model. And he noticed early on that the T767I mice had a lower body weight at all time points than their litter mates. So they are significantly reduced in weight at all time points. We see a further reduction once they have seizure onset, again, starting around P14 or 15. The EMX1 specific T767I mice have a normal weight gain and normal body weight until seizure onset, again, which is happening maybe around P15 or 16, and then they do start to lose weight due to having the seizures. So we immediately noticed that we had this disparity between the SOX2, all neurons, SCN8A, T767I, and the excitatory neurons, T767I. So we wanted to look at another measure of motor development or motor impairment, and that is the writing reflex. So a young mouse between P5 and P8, when it placed supine on their back, will reflexively immediately turn over. And that is exactly what we saw in our wild type, in our conditional allele, which is like that heterozygous null allele, and in our EMX1 specific T767I mice. So they all had normal writing. However, when we had the SOX2 T767I mice, we saw this very significant delay in writing reflex. The mice are not able to coordinate their movement enough to write themselves appropriately. And we saw this consistently over time. Eventually, the mice do age out of this specific test. So we were very excited about this result because it looked like we may be able to model some of this motor impairment in this new mouse. So we went on to look at actual muscle strength. We looked at a front limb suspension test and a hind limb suspension test and measured the latency to fall for the mice. Again, our SOX2 T767I mutant mice are severely impaired in being able to actually hold themselves with their muscle strength. However, we did not see this impairment in the EMX1 or either of our controls, the wild type or that heterozygous null condition. So the muscle weakness is not due to having 50% less SCN8A in certain neuron types, like in the EMX1. It's specific to the SOX2 T767I, and we see the same trend where they have a significantly reduced ability to hold themselves up by their hind limbs. A more subjective assay was to look at their gait, so to actually watch the mice walking around and measuring how often they would have mild tremor, severe tremor, or actually fall down. And the SOX2 T767I mice have a much more severe gait phenotype at all ages. And whereas other mice might have mild tremor, just due to being so young, that does eventually resolve, but it never resolves in our SOX2 T767I mutant mice. And so taken together, what all of this data demonstrates is that the mechanisms underlying seizures, which we see in those EMX1 specific T767I mice, and the mechanisms underlying the motor impairment, which we only see when we have the general expression of SCN8A T767I, are distinct. There's something besides those excitatory neuron, cortex hippocampus neurons that is driving the motor impairment. So we decided to look at a class of neurons that may potentially have something to do with motor control, and that is motor neurons. And the way that we were able to get at motor neuron activity was to actually look at the motor unit function. So the motor unit is actually the motor neuron innervating into the muscle. And our colleagues in the Cole lab here at Ohio State have a way to actually measure directly in the muscle, both the compound muscle action potential, and then use that to get a motor unit number estimation. So how many functional motor units are there really in these mice? And what we found was that in our T767I heterozygotes, we had a significant reduction in compound muscle action potential, and this translated into a significant reduction into functional motor units. So we are thinking that in our SCN8A T767I mouse model, we're actually seeing that this SCN8A mutation is having a detrimental effect on those motor units, and we hypothesize that it's due to dysregulation of the motor neuron activity itself, and that's something we're going to be looking into. So just to summarize our mouse models of SCN8A DEE, I've been involved with characterizing 3 of these. They 1 constitutive knock-in, 2 conditionals. The 2 conditional mice, which are more severe, have 100% penetrance and early onset seizures. All of these models recapitulate seizures and premature lethality and are good models of SCN8A epilepsy. However, a little bit of cognition and behavior was done in N1768D. They're largely normal. It's not been able to be assessed in these more severe models. However, motor pathology has only been seen in the new T767I model. So I think this is going to be a great model to study the other components of the developmental and epileptic encephalopathy other than just the seizure phenotypes. So I'm excited to be working on this mouse now in my laboratory. Our next steps, which is going to be funded with a new R01 awarded to my lab, is to evaluate neuromotor development. So really starting from P0 and going longitudinally, actually look at how the motor and movement develops in these mice and where the different deficiencies are. And we have some of that data already. It's exciting. We want to also temporally restrict the expression of T767I to determine if there is some sort of window in which these motor units are especially vulnerable to SCN8A gain of function. We are also going to be molecularly assessing motor unit structure. We're going to look at the function and the connectivity in more detail. And finally, we're going to take advantage of the conditional nature of this allele to look at expression of T767I in subsets of different types of neurons that could be involved in motor function. For example, CHAC-CRE to look at most motor neurons, and PCP2-CRE to look at cerebellar neurons. And this work is ongoing in the lab. I'm excited to get started continuing with this work. So I just want to thank the members of my laboratory. We're still pretty small, but looking to grow with the new funding. Again, my graduate student, Mithun Ane, who's really driven this SCN8A mouse work, and then the collaborators here at OSU, our current funding, and then thank you all to everyone involved in supporting work on SCN8A epilepsy. Thank you for supporting my lab, and I'm happy to be able to share this exciting work with you today. Thank you very much.
We're almost there, guys. I just wanted to take a few minutes and have a few thank yous. And the first thank yous are going to be to John and Minaj. Thank you both for always being willing to moderate this. And I know both of you are just an email away, and I really, really appreciate that. I'd also like to take a moment to thank our two platinum sponsors, Neurocrine Biosciences and Praxis Precision Medicines. Both of you, without your support, this could not happen, and so we really, really appreciate that. I also want to take a moment and say thank you to my executive team, Shelley Frappier, Daniel Hayward, Karen Varner, Megan Varner, and Liz Ramirez. You guys are my people. I cannot thank you enough. Before I got into this side of the gathering planning, I was like, dang, they are good, and this just looks so easy. And then I'm like, oh gosh, this has a lot of moving parts. And so they're really good at making this look really easy, and obviously there's a lot of going on. So I appreciate you guys so much. I also appreciate the volunteers that we have here, and I can see them speckled around, and a lot of them have kids, are probably back upstairs trying to calm them down and get them ready for bed. But obviously we know what this life looks like and how much time and effort it is just to do your daily business. And so for you guys to take those moments to spend that extra time working for TCSF and volunteering, we really, really appreciate you. All right, so before we close for the evening, I'd like to take a moment to present our 2023 CUTIES Awards. So after the first SCN8A Clinician, Researcher, and Family Gathering held in 2015, TCSF saw a handful of individuals rising to the opportunity to work collaboratively to improve the health and safety of those living with SCN8A. As a result, we created the CUTIES, our annual awards for champions for understanding, treating, investigating, and empowering those with SCN8A. We have 3 CUTIES Award winners this year, 1 researcher, 1 clinician, and 1 family that have gone above and beyond for our community. TCSF's fundraising director and Lucy's mom, Danielle Hayward, will now present the Researcher Award.
Hello, everyone. I am honored to present the Researcher Award to Dr. Madeline Oden. Dr. Oden Dr. Oden, an associate professor at Tufts University, holds a PhD in neuroscience and conducted postdoctoral work in cancer research. In 2018, she established her own research lab at Tufts, initially concentrating on cancer research. However, when her daughter Margot was diagnosed with SCN8A, Dr. Oden shifted her lab's focus to the SCN8A space. Having dedicated 1.5 years to SCN8A research with a specific emphasis on ASOs, Dr. Oden continues to direct her attention to targeting alternative splicing for treating SCN8A epilepsy. Her unique voice as both a scientist and an SCN8A parent has made her a powerful advocate for the SCN8A community. She is a valued collaborator in the SCN8A space, coordinating and collaborating on a number of studies with the goals of better understanding and advancing treatment in SCN8A. She is always open to engaging with the SCN8A community, sharing her knowledge and insights, and presenting complex concepts in ways that are easy for caregivers and parents to digest. Dr. Oden, we express our gratitude for your research, unwavering commitment to our community. You're the best. Now, TCSF's Director of Patient Engagement and Data Management and Nico's mom, Shelley Frappier, will present the Clinician Award.
Good evening, and thank you for sticking with us. And I think we're going to end on close on time today. We have decided to give the Clinician Award to Dr. Scott Perry. Dr. Perry is the medical director of neurology and the genetic epilepsy clinic at Cook Children's Hospital in Fort Worth, Texas. Dr. Perry's clinical and research interests focus on the treatment of childhood onset epilepsy, specifically those patients with uncontrolled epilepsy. Many SCN8A parents living in and around Texas drive hours to see him in clinic due to his robust SCN8A knowledge base, but also because of his kind and gentle bedside manner. And Lacey Dorosky, Sadie's mom, said it the best. When we received our daughter's devastating diagnosis, we were lost and had already seen countless doctors. We were determined to find a doctor who had some knowledge of SCN8A, even if that meant traveling across the country. After doing some research, I came across Dr. Perry, who had spoken at previous TCSF gatherings. I told my husband I found someone, and he's in Texas. The next day, we were scheduled to see our second geneticist at a neurology clinic. I mentioned to her that there was a Dr. Perry in Fort Worth. She said, "Oh, those are my people. I used to work with Dr. Perry and his staff when I worked at Cook's. Let me see what I can do." 24 hours later, we were scheduled to see the man himself, Dr. Perry. A few weeks went by. Our daughter continued to have countless seizures requiring oxygen. The time finally arrived for us to take our 4-month-old on a 5.5-hour trip to Cook Children's. We packed our bags, expecting to be admitted for testing. When Dr. Perry walked in, we were immediately put at ease. He was very confident and current with SCN8A research. He knew which medication had the greatest success, and he said we were going to try that. It gave us hope. He gave us hope that there were medications out there that others had success with. He gave us hope that there was current research going on, and he restored our hope in doctors. Dr. Perry truly cares for each patient he sees and is very knowledgeable when it comes to the spectrum of SCN8A. If it wasn't for Dr. Perry, Sadie's story would look much different. Today, she is a 5-year-old attending preschool with her twin brother in a general education classroom. We just celebrated 4 years seizure freedom, and I credit that to the knowledge that Dr. Perry had with SCN8A. Congratulations, Dr. Perry, on this award. Thank you for your continued dedication in empowering those with SCN8A. Unfortunately, Dr. Perry is unable to join us this evening, but we will ensure he receives his award. And I'm going to pass the microphone off to Kacie, who will give our family cutie.
feel like we need like a drum roll. The family award goes to Krista and Shawn Smith. As evident from, come on up here guys, as evident from earlier this evening, Krista and Shawn Smith have truly demonstrated exceptional dedication to our SCN8A community. Their commitment extends beyond the scope of just the Connor James Smith Patient Assistant Grant, as they initially mobilized efforts to raise around $15,000 for TCSF following Connor's SCN8A diagnosis. This year alone, their relentless efforts have yielded an additional $14,000 in funds, complemented by a generous personal donation. Yet their contributions transcend mere financial support. When Krista and Shawn made a heartfelt promise to Connor at his bedside, they embarked on a journey that goes beyond monetary contributions. Krista and Shawn have also emerged as steadfast advocates for SCN8A families facing hurdles in accessing crucial specialized equipment. Recognizing the challenges that arise when insurance and other avenues deny much needed support, they have dedicated themselves to providing assistance where it is most crucial, which demonstrates a profound commitment that goes beyond fundraising efforts. Their advocacy and support serve as a beacon of hope for those grappling with the complexities of securing vital resources. Thank you both so very much. And we will continue our collaborative efforts to honor Connor. Thank you guys so much. Yes, we've got to get pictures. Right. Hey, Shelly, do you mind to grab this one? I'm afraid I'm going to drop it. Shelly. I was just afraid it was going to slide right off. Not really the ending I was hoping for. As we draw the curtains on this gathering, I am profoundly moved by the shared experiences, the collective strength, and the unwavering commitment displayed by each of you. This gathering has been more than a meeting. It has been a testament to the resilience of our community and the power of unity in the face of SCN8A. In reflecting on the challenges of the past year, losses that have left permanent marks on our hearts, and surgeries that have tested the fortitude of families, we find ourselves at crossroads. It is in these moments of reflection that our commitment to From Surviving to Thriving theme takes on a profound meaning. We stand together, not just as survivors, but as forces of change, steering our collective journey towards a future where thriving becomes the norm. I extend my deepest gratitude to each participant, the clinicians, the researchers, families, industry partners, and supporters, for your active engagement, your willingness to learn and to share, and your tireless dedication to the cause. The CUTE Syndrome Foundation is not merely an organization, it is a family bound by common purpose, and each of you plays an integral role in shaping the narrative of hope. As we part ways, let us carry the spirit of this gathering into our respective spheres, spreading awareness, fostering collaboration, and advocating for the changes needed to improve the lives of those with SCN8A. Together, we will move forward from surviving to thriving. With hearts full of compassion, minds brimming with knowledge, and a shared commitment to creating a future filled with all possibilities. Thank you all for being here. Safe travels, and until we meet again at the crossroads of hope and progress, or at the bar outside. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate it.